Hey there, and welcome back. If you have come here to be taken out of your own day for a while, the lights low, the noise of your life finally dimming down, the hours ahead given over to rest, then settle in, because tonight we are going somewhere that does not exist. Not anymore, and for most of the year, not even then. Tonight, we are traveling back 600 years to stand in the middle of a city that was built every autumn out of timber and canvas and rope on an empty field beside a river. Lived in and traded in and feasted in for a few roaring weeks, and then taken entirely to pieces and carted away, until the field was just a field again, and the geese came back to graze where the richest merchants in Europe had stood haggling over gold. Tonight we are going to the greatest fair in medieval England. It was held on a common outside Cambridge in the cooling weeks of September, and for the length of its season it was one of the busiest places in the whole kingdom. A temporary town with streets and squares and its own law and its own court, where you could buy a barrel of Spanish wine or a Flemish cloth or a pound of pepper that had begun its journey in the islands beyond India, where a scholar and a shepherd and a great lady's steward might all be reaching for the same wheel of cheese. We are going to walk its rows from the cool of the early morning to the long shadows of the evening. We are going to smell the cook fires and the tar and the trodden grass, hear the criers and the coins and the bargaining in half a dozen tongues, and feel the press of the greatest crowd most medieval people would ever stand in. And before the day is out, we are going to step inside a small tented court where a man could be accused, judged, and punished before the dust had time to settle on his shoes. And I will tell you, when we get there, exactly why they called it the Court of the Dusty Feet. Before we go in, one small and quiet thing, the way you might pause at the edge of the field before joining the crowd. A fair was a place people came to from far and wide and near at hand. Strangers in their thousands gathered for a few days in one spot, and these evenings have a little of that in them too. A great scattered company of folk, all over the world, drawn to the same quiet hour. I like knowing which corner of the earth you have come from tonight, and what the hour is where you are lying. So if you would like to leave that somewhere below, I do read them, and I like knowing who is in the crowd. And if these journeys into the far past are something you would care to return to, you would be very welcome to come along again, whenever the next one is ready. There is no hurry at all. The gates are not open yet. We have the whole day ahead of us, and the entire night to spend it in. So, picture this. It is not long after dawn on a grey gold morning in the middle of September, somewhere in the last decades of the 14th century, and you are walking along a track at the edge of the flat green country northeast of Cambridge, with the dew still cold on the grass and a mist lying low over the river off to your right. The river is the Cam, sliding quiet and brown between its reeds, and the track you are on runs alongside it toward a wide common of open grazing land where the parish of Cambridge gives way to the fields of the little village of Stourbridge. There is wood smoke on the air already, a great deal of it, far more than a village this size could ever make. There is a sound, too, carried on the cool morning air from somewhere ahead, a low, broad, rising murmur, the sound of a very great many people and animals all in one place, the sound that a town makes here, where you know perfectly well there is no town at all. And then the track lifts a little, and you come over a low rise, and you stop, because there below you, spread across the whole of the common, where last month there was nothing but grass and grazing cattle, is a city. Not a city of stone, and not a city that was here in the spring or will be here at Christmas, but a city all the same streets of it, laid out in long straight rows across the grass. Hundreds upon hundreds of booths and stalls and tents and timber sheds, ranged side by side as neat as the houses of a real town. with lanes running between them and open squares opening out among them, and the smoke of 1,000 morning fires standing up straight in the still air. Carts are still arriving along every track that feeds the common, piled high under their canvas. Barges lie thick along the river bank, their masts a little floating forest, being unloaded by the light of the new day. And over all of it hangs that sound, growing now as you come down toward it, the sound of England's greatest fair waking up and getting ready to trade. This is Stourbridge Fair, and to understand what you are looking at, you have to set aside almost everything the word gathering means to you now. This was not an afternoon's amusement. This was one of the great commercial events of the medieval year. A mart so large and so important that merchants crossed the sea for it. That vast households 100 miles away laid in their whole winter's stores at it. That the wool of 1,000 English farms, and the spices of the Far East, and the furs of the frozen North, all changed hands on this one stretch of Cambridgeshire grass. For a few weeks every autumn, this empty common became, in effect, the trading heart of eastern England, and one of the busiest marketplaces in the land. And then, when the season ended, every plank and pole and length of canvas was taken down, loaded onto the carts and the barges, and carried away, and the rents stopped, and the crowds went home, and the grass grew back over the bare rectangles where the booths had stood, and the geese returned. And you could stand on this rise in November and never know that the richest festival in England had been here at all. We are going to spend the whole of one day inside it, while it lives. We are going to arrive now, in the cool and the half-empty quiet of the early morning before the throngs thicken, and we are going to stay until the long light of evening, when the deals are done and the tired traders begin, stall by stall, to take their city apart. But before we walk down into the rows and lose ourselves in the noise of it, I want to tell you how a thing like this came to be standing on an empty field outside Cambridge in the first place. Because the story of why the market was here, and who was allowed to hold it, and the unlikely souls who were owed its enormous profits, is stranger and gentler than you might expect. That is where we are going first. Come back with me then, a little under 200 years before this September morning, to a different and harder time, when this same common carried not a city of booths, but a small and lonely house set apart from the world. For there had stood here, since early in the 12th century, a hospital, and not a hospital as we would know one, but a refuge for the most pitied and most feared people of the medieval globe, the lepers. Leprosy was the great horror of the age, a slow and disfiguring affliction that the law and the church required its sufferers to be cut off from the company of the living, declared dead in a grim ceremony, and shut away in houses like this one, set deliberately outside the towns, downwind and downstream, where the well need not look on them. The hospital here was dedicated to Saint Mary Magdalene, and a little stone chapel was raised for it, that still stands to this day, small and plain and very old, the one piece of all this that was built to last. The lepers lived on charity, on what the pious gave for the good of their souls, and on whatever the house could raise to keep its few unfortunate souls in bread. And it was for them, for the lepers of Saint Mary Magdalene, that the fair was first granted. In the year 1211, King John, the same King John whose quarrels with his barons would, a few years later, give the world the great charter of English liberties, set his seal to a charter of a humbler kind, granting to the leper hospital here the right to hold a mart on its land and to take the profits of it for the support of the sick. This was an act of royal charity, and it was also, in its way, an act of royal business, because the right to hold a festival was a valuable thing the crown could give, and giving it cost the king nothing and earned him the gratitude of God and the church both. To the lepers, it was a lifeline. The tolls and rents that a gathering could raise, even a small one, might keep the house in food and fuel through a winter. No one setting that seal could have dreamt what the modest charity granted to a handful of lepers on a Cambridgeshire common would grow into, that within a few generations it would become the largest gathering in all of England, drawing the trade of half of Europe to the door of a leper house. But that is how these things began. A king's seal, a few sick and hidden souls, and a stretch of empty grass by a slow brown river. From such small and quiet beginnings, the whole roaring city we are about to enter was born. Hold that in your mind as we go down, because it changes how the fair feels once you know it. All the noise and the gold and the haggling, all the spices of the Indies and the wines of Gascony, all of it sat, at least at the start, upon a foundation of mercy, the idea that the buying and selling of the entire known world might be made to pour a little of its wealth into the laps of the forgotten and the unclean. By our September morning, 2 centuries on, the lepers themselves had all but vanished, for leprosy was fading from England by then, and the old house stood nearly empty, its purpose worn thin by time, its profits long since fought over by the town and the priory and the powers that always gather where money flows. But the chapel still stood. The market still bore the marks of its beginning. And somewhere in the machinery of who was owed what, the ghost of those first lepers lingered still. It is worth pausing on the sheer improbability of what grew from that small seed, because it is one of the strangest growths in the whole history of English trade. A king grants, almost as an afterthought of charity, the right to hold a modest gathering to a little house of lepers, expecting nothing more than that it might keep a few sick souls in bread. And from that grant, over the unhurried centuries, swells the largest market in all of England, a mart that draws the merchants of half of Europe, that handles the wool and the cloth and the spice and the treasure of a continent. That becomes, for a few weeks each year, one of the busiest and richest places in the entire kingdom. The little charity outgrew itself beyond all imagining, the way a planted seed outgrows the hand that dropped it, until the festival dwarfed utterly the humble purpose it had been granted for. And the lepers it was meant to feed were a forgotten footnote to the roaring commerce that bore their hospital's name. There is something almost dizzying in the scale of that growth, in the distance between the cause and the effect, between the few sick men in their lonely house and the thousands upon thousands who would one day throng the common in their name. The medieval world was full of such slow accumulations, such institutions that began small and grew over generations into something their founders could never have dreamed, for it was an age that built in centuries and let things ripen at the pace of lifetimes. And the mart was among the greatest of them, a vast tree of commerce grown from a single minor seed of mercy, spreading wider with each passing generation until its branches reached clear across the sea. Hold that improbability in your mind as we go down into it, for it makes the ordinary roar of the trade seem, somehow, a little miraculous. Now, though, the morning is wearing on, and the criers are about to do the thing that turns this field of waiting booths into a living market. Come and hear it. A fair did not simply happen because people gathered. It had to be opened, formally and lawfully, by the voice of authority. And until it was opened, it was not truly a festival at all, but only a field full of waiting traders, their stalls built and their goods unpacked, and their hands itching to begin, held back by custom and by law from making a single sale. So in the early hours, while the dew is still on the canvas, the men whose right it is to govern the gathering move out among the rows to perform the proclamation, the ceremony that switches this whole sleeping city on. Listen for it now. Somewhere among the lanes a bell is ringing, and behind it comes a small procession officers of the town and of the great priory nearby, and with them the proctors of the University of Cambridge, for the scholars too had ancient rights here, granted by kings, to oversee the weights and the measures and the honesty of the dealing. They halt at the appointed places, and a crier lifts his voice, and the words he reads out are the rules of the gathering, the terms on which all of this is permitted to take place. And what rules they are! He proclaims the peace of the fair, the solemn promise that for its season this common is a place of order where quarrels will be judged and the king's peace kept, so that strangers may trade without fear. He proclaims the tolls that must be paid, and to whom, the standards of weight and measure that every seller must keep, the coin that will be honoured. He proclaims the punishments for those who cheat, who use false weights or sell shoddy goods as sound or pick a purse in the press. He names the court that will sit to judge all disputes. And we shall come to that court before the day is out, for it is one of the strangest and swiftest instruments of justice the age produced. And when the proclamation is finished, and the last word has been read out and the bell rung, the thing is done. The mart is open. A great breath seems to go through the whole common. The first coins change hands. The criers of the individual traders take up their cries. And the city that did not legally exist a moment ago springs fully into its roaring, bargaining life. It is worth pausing on that, because it tells you something true about the medieval world that is easy to miss. How much of life ran on permission, on charter and custom and the granted right, on the difference between a thing done lawfully and the same thing done without leave. A man could not simply decide to hold a market. The right to gather buyers and sellers was a privilege, given by the crown, jealously guarded, worth fighting over in the courts. Because whoever held it took the profits. Towns went to law against one another over gatherings. A huge mart like this one could beggar the ordinary markets of the towns around it, drawing away their trade for weeks, and so the holding of it, and the timing of it, and the tolls of it were matters of the gravest importance to a great many people. The proclamation we have just heard was not mere ceremony. It was the visible edge of a whole invisible structure of law and money and power. The framework that made it possible for thousands of strangers to come together on an empty field and trust one another enough to do business. Now, though, the fair is open and the morning is filling, and it is time to go in. Come with me through the bounds. You do not simply wander into a market like this. It has edges, and the edges are watched. As we come down off the rise and approach the nearest entrance to the rows, we pass the men who sit at the bounds of the mart to take the tolls, for the right to enter and to trade here is not free, and the collecting of what is owed begins at the very threshold. A countryman driving a beast to sell pays his toll at the edge. A trader bringing in a cartload of goods pays for the right to bring them. Even we, walking in with nothing to sell, move through a place that is counting and watching and reckoning up its dues from the first step. And then we are through, and the lanes close around us, and the open morning country is suddenly gone, shut out behind walls of timber and canvas, and we are inside the strange enclosed world of the festival. The first thing that strikes you is that it really is laid out like a town. This is no scatter of stalls thrown down anywhere. The booths arranged in long, straight, ordered rows, line after line of them running parallel across the grass, with cross lanes between, so that the whole common is divided into a grid of streets as deliberate as any planned city. And the streets are sorted by trade. The medieval mind loved to group like with like, and so each row or stretch of it belongs to a particular kind of goods. Here a lane of cloth, there a line of ironmongery. Here the aisles where the spices and the costly things are sold. There the quarter given over to the leather and the shoes. A buyer who knows the festival knows exactly where to go for what he wants, walks straight to the right lane, and there finds a dozen sellers of the same wares ranged side by side, competing for his custom, so that the very layout of the place sharpens the bargaining. It is a shopper's logic 600 years old, and it is laid out here in timber and rope on a Cambridgeshire, common with a precision that would not shame a modern street of shops. And the noise, now that we are inside it, is a wall. The criers are the loudest of it, every trader or his boy bawling the virtues of his wares, the clothman and the spicer and the seller of hot pies, all crying out at once over one another, a competing roar of voices that never lets up. Under it runs everything else, the bargaining, the haggling back and forth, the slap of a hand on a hand to seal a deal, the rumble of cartwheels on the trodden lanes, the lowing and bleating of the beasts in the livestock quarter, the ring of a coin tested on a board, the bark of a dog, the cry of a child, a snatch of a song from somewhere, the dull roar of thousands of human voices all talking and dealing and arguing at once. After the quiet of the morning country, it is almost a physical blow, and a person who had come in from a silent village, as most who came here had, must have stood for a moment simply stunned by the sheer human density of it. The press and the racket and the smell, for the smell hits you too, all at once, wood smoke and roasting meat and trodden dung and tar and spice, and the warm animal reek of a great crowd layered thick on the morning air. This is the fair. We are in it now. Let us go and see what it has come together to sell. But before we lose ourselves among the booths, come with me to the edge of the common where the river runs, because the stream is the secret of the whole thing. The reason this particular field and no other became the trading heart of the east of England. The Cam does not look like much as it slides past the common, a slow brown lowland stream between its reeds. But follow it downstream and it joins the greater river, the Ouse, and the Ouse runs north to the sea at the busy port they called Lynn, where the ships of the world put in. And that means this quiet common, far inland though it seems, is in truth joined by water to the open sea and to every coast that the sea touches. Goods that came into Lynn from across the German Ocean, from Flanders and the Low Countries, from the Baltic and the Hanseatic towns, from Gascony and Spain and the Mediterranean beyond, could be loaded into the flat shallow barges and lighters that worked the inland rivers and brought, mile by patient mile, upstream and inland, to be set down here on the grass at Stourbridge. Without the river, there would have been no fair. With it, the gathering could reach out and draw the trade of half a continent up a Cambridgeshire stream. So look at the riverbank now in the early light, because it is one of the great sights of the gathering. The barges lie thick along it, moored gunwale to gunwale, a whole crowded waterfront of them, their stubby masts making that little floating forest you saw from the rise. And they are being unloaded with a will, for the goods must be got ashore and into the booths before the buyers come in earnest. Gangs of porters heave the bales and the barrels and the chests up the bank, sweating already in the cool of the morning, and the things they carry are a roll call of the wider world come to rest on English grass. Here come the enormous bales of foreign cloth, and the butts of wine, and the chests that you can smell before you can see them, pungent with pepper and spice. Here come barrels of tar and pitch from the northern forests, and bundles of iron, and stacks of timber boards, and casks of salted fish, and packs of fur. It is a slow, heaving, shouting business, the unloading, and it goes on through the whole of the fair, the barges coming and going, the wealth of distant places flowing up the river and onto the bank and into the rows, where it will be turned, by a few weeks of hard bargaining, into English silver. Now, with the goods coming ashore behind us, let us go and find where the greatest of them are sold. And the greatest of all, the trade on which medieval England's entire wealth was built, was wool and the cloth made from it. If there is one thing you must understand about the England these people lived in, it is that it floated on wool. The sheep that grazed its hills and fields by the million grew a fleece that was prized across all of Europe as the finest to be had, and the selling of that wool, raw to the weavers of Flanders and Italy, or woven at home into English cloth, was the engine of the realm's prosperity, the source of the merchants' fortunes and the king's taxes and the great churches that wool money raised across the land. So it is no surprise that a long and busy stretch of the gathering is given over to it, and that the dealing here is the most serious to be found anywhere on the common. Come into the cloth rows and feel the change in the air. The bawling is a little less here. The men are graver, the bargains larger, the sums that change hands enough to make a countryman's head swim. Walk the length of it and see what is laid out. There are the broadcloths of England, heavy and close-woven and warm, the everyday wealth of the country, folded in bolt upon bolt. There are finer stuffs, the worsteds, smooth and strong. And there, costliest of all, the foreign cloths brought up the river. The famous cloths of Flanders, woven from English wool, sent overseas, and returned as finished luxury at many times the price. And scarlets dyed deep and rich, and fine linens, and here and there kept carefully apart and shown only to those who can pay. A glimpse of silk from the looms of Italy, shimmering and impossibly dear, brought half across the known world to be fingered by a wide-eyed buyer in a tent on a Cambridgeshire common. The customers move along the rows with a sharp and practised eye, for cloth is a thing that hides its faults from the careless. They hold it to the light to judge the weave. They rub it between finger and thumb. They look for the marks and seals that an honest weaving town stamped on its cloth to guarantee its measure and its quality, and they know, every one of them, the 1,000 small tricks by which a dishonest seller might stretch a cloth, or mend a floor, or pass off the second rate as the fine. A great deal of money rides on these judgments. The cloth rows are where the fair does its most important business, and where its largest fortunes are made and lost. From the gravity of the cloth rows, let us turn to the row that smells of the ends of the earth. For somewhere in the market, kept close and watched well, are the spices, and to a medieval person there was nothing on the common more wondrous or more telling of distant places than these. Come into the spices quarter and breathe in. The very air is different here, warm and pungent and strange, thick with scents that no English field or forest ever grew. Here is pepper, the king of spices, sold by the careful ounce and worth. Weight for weight, a labourer's wages, peppercorns that had begun their journey on the far side of the world and passed through more hands than anyone could count to reach this booth. Here is ginger and cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg and the costly powders and the dried roots, each one a marvel of distance, each one carrying in its scent the rumour of lands the buyer would never see and could scarcely imagine. Here is sugar, still a rare and precious thing, sold in hard cones to those who could afford to sweeten their feasts like princes. Here is wax for the candles of the rich and the altars of the churches, and the seller weighs it all out on his small, precise scales with the gravity of a man handling treasure, because that, in effect, is what it is. It is worth standing here a moment to think about what a single peppercorn meant. It had grown on a vine in the heat of the Indies, half a world away, in lands that to the medieval English mind were the stuff of legend, of marvels and monsters and the earthly paradise. It had been picked and dried and carried to the coast and shipped across seas, and unloaded and loaded again, and borne by camel, and by mule, and by ship, and by barge through the hands of Arab traders and Italian merchants and Flemish factors and English chapmen, taxed and tolled at every border, for month upon month and mile upon mile, until at last it came to rest in a small heap, on a board, in a tent, on a wet common in Cambridgeshire, to be bought by the ounce, by a steward, laying in spices, for his lord's Christmas table. The whole vast web of medieval trade, reaching from the islands of the east to this field by the Cam, was folded into that one slight dark grain. To buy a pound of pepper here was to hold the far edge of the world in your hand. No wonder they treasured it. Now, with the scent of it still in our noses, let us see what came from the cold north rather than the hot south. The north sent its own treasures up the river, and they were of a plainer and harder kind than the spices, but no less wanted. Come into the quarter where the goods of the cold lands are sold, the things that came down out of the Baltic and the German seas in the holds of the Hanseatic ships, and up the Ouse to Lynn and on to here. Furs first, and a great trade it was, for in a world without any warmth but fire and wool, a good fur was both comfort and rank, and the pelts laid out here ran from the costly to the common. There are the rich dark furs that only the great could wear, sable and marten, and the soft grey of squirrel sewn in their hundreds into the linings of the wealthy, and there are humbler skins, lambskin and rabbit and cat, for those of lesser means who still wish to keep out the cold. The law itself dictated who might wear what, for dress was a badge of station, and a poor man in a lord's fur was an offence against the order of things. So the buyers here bought within their place as much as within their purse. And beyond the furs, the raw stuff of life and work. Here is iron, in bars and billets, the iron that the smith would beat into every tool and blade and nail and horseshoe the country needed. Much of it shipped from the ore-rich lands across the sea. Here is tar and pitch for the caulking of ships and the dressing of timber. Here is timber itself, the long straight boards of northern pine that England's own slow oaks could not easily supply. Here are great barrels of fish, the salted herring and the dried cod that fed the whole of Christendom through its many fast days, stacked and reeking and counted out by the cartload. For fish was not a delicacy here, but a staple, the protein of the poor and the pious alike. It is a less glamorous quarter than the spices and the silks, this corner of iron and tar and saltfish, but in truth it is closer to the real business of the fair. For these were the things that households and workshops and entire towns came here to lay in by the wagon load, the unglamorous necessities bought in bulk against the coming winter. We have looked at the grand staple trades, the wool and the cloth and the spices and the iron and the saltfish, the wares that came by the cartload and the cargo. But a mart this size sold 1,000 finer and smaller things besides, and to walk its rows was to pass from the bulk goods of the world to the most delicate, and I want to show you some of them before we speak of how the bargaining was done. Come first to the line where the precious things are sold, where the goldsmiths and the dealers in costly small wares have their booths, and where the guarding is heaviest of all. For here, on tables, watched by hard-eyed men, lay the treasure of the market in little rings and brooches and clasps of gold and silver, set with stones, cups and spoons, and plate of precious metal for the tables of the great. Girdles worked with silver, beads of amber and coral and jet, the small portable wealth that a prosperous family put its money into. For, in an age without banks, a jewel or a piece of plate was savings you could wear and sell again at need. The goldsmith was a man of standing, and his trade was watched and regulated more closely than almost any other, for the temptation to cheat in precious metal was enormous, and the means subtle base metal gilded to pass as gold. Silver, debased with cheaper stuff. Stones of glass, sold as gems. So the buyer of precious things was the wariest customer on the common, and the goldsmiths who dealt honestly guarded their reputation as their greatest asset, and marked their good work with the stamps that vouched for its purity. To linger at the goldsmith's table was to see the concentrated wealth of the age, the gold of 100 bargains turned into a few small glittering things, and to see, too, the longing on the faces of those who could only look. The country folk gazing at riches they would never own as at something out of a tale. Now, from the costly and the rare, let us turn to the goods that the ordinary person actually came to buy, for these were the true heart of the fair's trade by sheer number, even if they were humbler than gold. Come into the rows of the leather workers and the everyday craftsmen, for this was where most of the people spent most of their pennies. Leather was everywhere in the medieval world, and the workers in it had a long stretch of the fair. The cordwainers with their shoes and boots, the makers of belts and purses and bottles and harness, the glovers with their wares laid out by the dozen. A pair of well-made shoes was a real purchase for an ordinary family, bought with thought and made to last and mended many times, and the leather rose did a steady, serious, unglamorous business in the things that shod and girded and carried the whole of the population. Near them stood the sellers of the other necessary crafts, the potters with their earthenware, jugs and bowls and cooking pots stacked in straw against the breakage, the turners with their wooden ware, the bowls and cups and platters and spoons that the poor ate from. Cheap and sturdy and made by the thousand, the basket makers with their woven work, the makers of knives and the traders of small ironmongery, the needles and pins and buckles and nails that a household could not do without. These were the goods that mattered most to most people, and the buying of them was the real business of the mart, for the great majority who came, the country families laying in the year's little necessities. The pins and the pots, and the shoes and the knives that wore out and had to be replaced, and were cheapest and best chosen here at the great fair, where the makers competed side by side. There was no glamour in it, but there was something true, for this was the mart doing its plainest and most useful work, supplying the actual stuff of ordinary medieval life to the ordinary people who lived it. A good wife went home from the gathering, not with gold or spice, but with a new pot and a paper of pins, and a length of cloth and a pair of shoes for the eldest child, and counted it a good year if she had managed it, and that, far more than the silk and the sable, was what the market was really for. Now, there is one more trade I want to show you before we leave the goods behind, and it is one you might not expect to find on a muddy common, for it belonged to the life of the mind. Cambridge was close at hand, and Cambridge meant the university, that gathering of scholars and masters that had taken root in the town a century and more before our morning, and was growing, year by year, into one of the two great seats of learning in the realm. And the presence of the scholars left its mark on the festival, for learned men needed things that ordinary markets did not supply, and the booksellers and the dealers in the stuff of study found a market here. Come and see the row where the writing trades have their place. Here is parchment and vellum, the prepared skins on which everything was written in an age before cheap paper, sold in sheets and quires to those who would copy or be copied for. Here is paper too, newer and cheaper, and spreading come up the river from the mills of the continent. Here are the things a scholar or a clerk required, the ink and the quills, the wax for sealing, the styluses and the tablets. And here, costly and precious and few, are books themselves, each one a treasure copied out by hand over many weeks, worth more than a horse, handled by the dealer with the care such wares deserved, and bought only by the institutions and the men who could afford the price of months of a scribe's labour. The scholars themselves came down to the fair, of course, as everyone did. The masters and the students, escaping their lecture halls for the noise and colour of the common. And they were a recognizable kind among the crowd, marked by their clothes and their tonsures and their Latin, browsing the book row, arguing among themselves, no doubt looking down a little on the trade around them, even as they took their pleasure in it. And the university was not only a presence in the throng, but a power at the market, for the scholars had wrung from the kings, over the years, real rights over the common, the right to oversee the weights and the measures, to assize the bread and the ale, to share in the governing and the judging of the mart alongside the town that resented them for it. The book row and the watchful proctors were the two faces of the university at the gathering. The life of the mind come down to the marketplace, both to buy its parchment and to keep its jealous eye on the honesty of the dealing. And before we leave the goods, give a thought to one trade so ordinary that it is easy to pass by, and yet without it, the whole world went dark at sundown. The trade in light. For an age that had no light but flame, the means of making it were a real and constant need, and the festival supplied them. There were the chandlers with their candles, and the candles came in two great kinds that divided the world as neatly as anything could. There was wax, the clean, bright-burning candle of beeswax, costly and sweet-smelling, the light of the churches and the great houses and the altars, and the wax for it was a serious business in its own right, much of it brought from afar. And there was tallow, the candle of rendered animal fat, cheap and smoky and rank-smelling, the light of the poor, who burned it sparingly, or did without, and went to bed with the sun. Between the wax taper on a lord's table and the guttering tallow dip in a labourer's cottage lay the whole distance of medieval society, written in light. The fair sold both, and the oil for the lamps besides, and the rushlights that were cheaper still, all the humble means by which people held back the dark a few hours longer. And a household laid in its winter light here, along with its winter food, against the long black evenings of the coming months. There was no romance in a bundle of tallow candles, but there was comfort in it, the simple comfort of a little light in the dark. And that, when you come down to it, was one of the things the mart was for. And that is only a part of the marvellous variety of the gathering. For I could walk you down a dozen more rows and show you a dozen more trades. But the day is passing, and we have other things to feel before the light goes. Now we have looked at a great deal of what was sold. Let me show you how it was actually bought, because the doing of a medieval bargain was an art in itself. There were no fixed prices here. That is the first thing to understand, and it changes everything. Nothing on the common carried a settled price the way the goods in a modern shop do. Every single transaction, from a penny pie to £100 cargo of cloth, was arrived at by haggling, by the long back and forth of offer and refusal between buyer and seller, and a person who could not bargain was a person who would be fleeced. So the fair rang all day with the music of it, the dealer naming a price far above what he would take, the purchaser scoffing and offering far below what he would give, the unhurried theatrical dance toward the middle, the walking away and the calling back, the appeals to heaven and to honesty and to the seller's poor starving children, the final price struck at last and sealed, very often, with a clasp and a slap of palm on palm, the handshake that made the bargain binding. To watch a skilled buyer and a skilled seller go at it was to watch a performance both knew the steps of and both, in a way, enjoyed. And the doing of the deal rested on things we have largely forgotten. There was the question of weight and measure, for a great deal was sold by weight, and the honesty of the seller's scales and weights was the difference between a fair deal and a robbery, which is exactly why the officers of the gathering and the watchful proctors of the university went about testing weights against the true standard and breaking those they found false. There was the question of coin, for the silver pennies that changed hands could be clipped or worn or counterfeit, and a careful man rang each coin on a board and weighed the doubtful ones. And a foreign merchant's strange coin had to be valued against the English. And for the larger dealings there was credit, for no one carried the price of a cargo of cloth in silver in his purse, and so merchants dealt in promises, in debts acknowledged and to be paid at the next market, or by the hand of a banker in London or Bruges, recorded sometimes on a tally, a notched stick split in two, so that each party held half, and neither could alter the reckoning. The mart ran on trust as much as on coin, on the web of reputation and obligation that bound the trading world together, and a man who broke his word at one mart would find the doors closed to him at the next. Now all this bargaining is hungry work, and the festival knew it. Come and smell the cook rows. You smell them long before you reach them. The cook rows, the lanes given over to those who fed the hungry crowd. And on a cool morning with the bargaining in full swing, there is no more welcome scent on the whole common than the one that comes drifting from the cooking fires. For a place this size was, among everything else, an enormous problem of feeding. Thousands of people far from their own hearths and needing to eat, and the cooks and the alewives and the piemen rose to it in their hundreds. Here are the cook shops, little booths with their fires going and their pots steaming, selling hot food to anyone with a coin pottage, ladled into a bowl you brought, or borrowed meat, roasting on spits and carved off hot, and above all pies, the great glory of the medieval cook shop. Pastry coffins baked full of meat or fish or fruit, sold by the hundred, eaten in the hand as the buyer walked on through the rows. The pie was the fair's true fast food, portable and filling and warm, and the smell of them baking must have followed you the whole length of the common. And to drink, there was ale, rivers of it. Ale was the common drink of every man, woman, and child in medieval England, brewed weak and drunk all day, safer than the water and a small comfort besides, and a gathering this size drank it by the ton. So the alewives and the ale booths did a roaring trade, and the drinking places were the social heart of the fair, where deals were toasted and quarrels were started, where the countryman gawped and the merchant unwound and the minstrel sang for his supper. There would have been wine too, for those who could pay, the good red wine of Gascony that came up the river in its barrels. But ale was the drink of the multitude, and as the day wore on and the ale went round, the market grew louder and warmer and merrier, and here and there a little quarrelsome, which is one reason, as we shall see, that the gathering kept its own court, ready to deal swiftly with those whom the ale or the greed or the temper led astray. Now, let me take you to that court, because it is one of the most remarkable things the medieval market invented. A mart drew strangers in their thousands, men and women from far away who would be gone in a few weeks and might never be seen again, and that posed a hard problem of justice. If a travelling trader cheated you, or sold you false goods, or struck you in a quarrel, what good was the ordinary law, with its slow grinding courts that might not sit for months, by which time the offender would be 100 miles away and forgotten? The fair needed justice that was as swift as the festival itself, that could hear a complaint and judge it and punish it before the parties scattered to the winds. And so the medieval mart invented one of the most practical courts the law has ever known, and gave it a name that tells you everything about how fast it worked. They called it the Court of the Dusty Feet. The name comes from the Old French pied poudre, the dusty-footed, and it meant the travelling merchant, the man with the dust of the road still on his shoes. And the court took its name from him, because it was made to give him justice before that very dust had time to settle. Come and look into it now, for it is sitting as it sat through every day of the gathering in its own booth or tent among the rows. There is the steward or the officer of the market who serves as judge. There are the men of the jury, drawn from the traders themselves, for who better to judge a dispute over the quality of cloth than other dealers in cloth? And before them comes the business of the fair's wrongs. The buyer who says he was sold short weight, the seller who says he was paid in clipped coin, the man whose purse was cut, the trader accused of false measure, the pair who came to blows over a bargain. The court hears them then and there. It calls the witnesses who are standing right outside. It reaches its judgment, and it gives its punishment. Often within the very day the wrong was done. A fine, the return of money, the seizure of false goods, the stocks for the cheat or the brawler, set up where all could see and jeer. There is something almost beautiful in the practicality of it. The whole apparatus of the law, scaled down and sped up and made to fit the brief, urgent life of the festival, so that a stranger from across the sea could trade here, knowing that if he were wronged, he would have justice before he left, and that if he wronged another, he would answer for it before he could flee. It was rough, and it was quick, and it was not always perfectly fair in our sense, but it worked, and it was one of the things that made a great market possible at all. For without the certainty of swift justice, who would risk their goods and their person among so many strangers? The court of the dusty feet was the iron frame of trust on which all the gentler business of buying and selling rested. And the court was only the sharpest edge of a whole visible apparatus of order that moved through the mart all day long. For a gathering this size could not be left to govern itself, and the peace that was proclaimed at the opening had to be kept by men on the ground through every hour. So as you walked the lanes you passed, again and again, the officers of the mart going about their work, the bailiffs and the sergeants charged with keeping the peace, moving through the crowd with the authority of the proclaimed law behind them, settling the small disputes before they grew, moving on, the troublesome, keeping an eye on the known faces of the dishonest. You passed the men testing the weights and the measures, going from booth to stall with the true standard, ready to break a false balance on the spot and haul its owner before the court. You passed the watch, less seen by day than by night, but present all the same, the eyes and hands of the fair's authority, and you felt, beneath the apparent chaos of the place, the firm presence of that order, the knowledge that this was a governed space, that the peace was real and enforced, that a wrong cried out would be answered. It is easy, looking back, to imagine the medieval world as lawless and rough, and it could be both. But a great gathering shows the other side of it too, the deep medieval genius for order and regulation and law, the careful structures that let thousands of strangers gather and trade in reasonable safety on an open field. The roar of the fair was loud, but it was a governed roar, held within a frame of law as real as the timber the booths were built from, and that frame, mostly unseen, was what made all the rest of it possible. Now the court existed, because the dangers were real, so let me show you the dangers it was made to guard against. For all its order and its law, a gathering was a dangerous place, and the danger came precisely from the thing that made it wonderful, the crowd. Gather thousands of strangers together with their purses full and their attention fixed on the goods, and you have created a paradise for the dishonest. And they came to the market as surely as the honest did, drawn by the same wealth from the opposite direction. The cut purse was the great fear, the thief who worked the press of the crowd with a sharp blade and a soft hand, slitting the strings of a purse and melting away before the victim felt the lightness at his belt. In a throng so dense that you were pressed body to body, a skilled cut purse could empty a careless man and be 3 rows away before the loss was noticed. And so every wary buyer kept a hand near his money and his wits about him, and carried his coin close against his skin, and trusted no one who pressed too near. The fair officers and the watch did what they could, and the stocks held a fresh cut purse most days. But for every one caught a dozen, worked the crowd untroubled, and the thief with the blade was only the crudest of the fair's dishonesties. Subtler by far was the cheat in the trade itself. The seller whose practiced dishonesty was woven into the very business of dealing. There was the false weight, the balance with a thumb on the scale, or the weight bored hollow, so that the ounce of pepper was no ounce at all. There was the adulterated good, the spice cut with something cheaper, the wine watered, the cloth stretched on the frame to measure longer than it truly was, the rotten fruit hidden beneath the sound. There was the outright lie about what a thing was. The common fur sold as the rare, the base metal as the precious, the unsound horse as the sound. The whole long history of human commerce is also a history of the cheats that shadow it, and the medieval mart had them all. Every trick that greed could devise to turn a stranger's trust into another man's silver. Which is why the watchful buyer was a hard customer, slow to believe and quick to test, and why the honest seller prized his good name above almost anything. For in a world of so many cheats, a reputation for fair dealing was a fortune in itself. Now the morning has worn on while we talked of thieves, and the market has filled to its brim. Come and stand with me in the press of it at midday, for there is nothing in the whole of medieval life quite like it. By the middle of the day, the mart has reached its full flood, and the crowd that fills the lanes is the largest crowd of human beings that most of the people in it will ever stand among in the whole of their lives. Think of what that meant. These were people who came, most of them, from villages of a few hundred souls, who passed their entire lives among faces they had known since birth, who might go from cradle to grave without once being in a multitude of strangers. And here they are, packed into the aisles of the gathering shoulder to shoulder, with thousands upon thousands of persons they have never seen and will never see again. A sea of strangers. A press so thick that to move through it is to be carried along as much as to walk. It must have been overwhelming and exhilarating and a little frightening. To a person whose ordinary world was so small. And look at who they all are, because the fair did the rare and remarkable thing of throwing every rank and kind of person together into the one crowd. Here is the great merchant in his furred gown, here the steward of a noble house with a long list and a heavy purse, buying the winter stores for 100 mouths. Here is the prosperous townsman and his wife in their good wool, here the parish priest, here the scholar down from the university, with ink on his fingers. Here is the yeoman farmer who has driven his beasts to sell. Here the village goodwife who has walked in to buy the few small luxuries of her year, a length of ribbon, a paper of pins, a little sugar, a knife. Here are servants and apprentices and labourers. Here the poor come to gawp and to beg. Here the soldiers and the sailors and the carters. Here the foreigners with their strange tongues and stranger clothes. For a few weeks on this common, the whole of England, and a good slice of Europe besides, was poured into the one churning crowd, every station of life rubbing shoulders in the press. And a sharp-eyed watcher standing in the middle of it could see the entire society of the age go by in an afternoon. There was nowhere else quite like it now. Let me draw you out of the thickest of the press and toward one of the loudest and most particular corners of the entire fair, where the dealing was as sharp as anywhere, and the reputation of the dealers darker than any. The horse market was a world unto itself, set a little apart where there was room for the beasts to be shown and trotted out, and it had a character all its own, sharp, loud, knowing, and famous. Then as now, for the slipperiness of those who dealt in it. For the horse was the most valuable beast a man could buy, the medieval equivalent of a costly and complicated machine, and buying one was fraught with peril, because a horse can hide its faults better than almost any other purchase, and the men who dealt in them, the horse copers, had a reputation for dishonesty so well earned that it has come down to us in the language itself. Come and watch the trade in horses, and keep your wits about you, for this is the sharpest dealing on the common. See how it is done. The coper trots the horse up and down before the buyer, showing its paces, talking all the while. A ceaseless stream of praise for the animal's wind, and its legs, and its temper, and its years. And the wary purchaser does not believe a word of it, because he knows the tricks. He knows that a horse can be drugged to seem quiet, that is in truth a savage, or fed and groomed to look in better case than it is, or its grey hairs dyed, or its age lied about. For the surest sign of a horse's years is in its teeth, and many a buyer has had his fingers in a horse's mouth at this fair, while the coper swore the beast was young. He knows a lame horse can be made to seem sound for the length of a trot, and a broken-winded one rested, so its heaving does not show. So the buying of a horse was a duel of wits, the coper concealing and the customer probing, and the law of how to judge a horse and how to catch out a cheating dealer was passed from father to son as essential knowledge. The horse trade was where the fair's edge of sharp dealing was keenest, and where a careless buyer was most surely fleeced. Now, the horse mart shaded into the wider traffic in beasts, and that was a different matter, plainer and earthier. So let me take you among the herds. Beyond the horses lay the rest of the livestock, and here the gathering was at its most ancient and elemental. For the buying and selling of beasts was the oldest business there was, and the most basic to the life of the countryside. Come into the quarter of the herds and the flocks, and mind your feet, for the ground here is churned to mud and worse by 1,000 hooves. The cattle stand penned and lowing, the oxen that drew the ploughs and the carts, the cows and the young beasts, driven here on their own legs, sometimes from many days' distance by the drovers, whose hard trade it was to walk the herds across the country to the great markets. The sheep are here in their hundreds, the source of all that wool wealth, penned and bleating and stinking warmly in the autumn air. There are pigs, squealing and rooting, and geese in their gabbling multitudes, and all the smaller creatures of the farmyard brought to be sold for the table or the breeding pen. And the timing of it mattered, for this was September, and September was the season of decision for the medieval farmer and his beasts. The summer's grazing was ending, and the long hungry winter was coming, and there was never fodder enough to keep every animal alive through it. So the autumn was the time of the great culling, when the farmer reckoned how many beasts he could feed through the cold months, and sold or slaughtered the rest. And the autumn fairs were where that reckoning was settled, where the surplus of the summer was turned into silver or into salt meat for the winter barrel. The beasts that changed hands here were not luxuries but the very capital of country life, and the dealing over them, though plainer than the silk and the spice, was in its way the most serious of all. For a man's whole year might hang on the price his beasts fetched at the autumn gathering. Now, we have walked through a great deal of hard trading. Come and see that the market was not only a place of business, for woven all through it was another thing entirely, the spectacle, the wonder, the sheer entertainment of it. For a mart was a holiday as much as a market, the one great break in the hard round of the working year. And the people who came to it came to be delighted as well as to buy and sell. And so among the rows of commerce there moved the whole travelling world of medieval entertainment. The showmen and the players who followed the fairs from town to town and made their living from the loosened purses and lifted spirits of the crowd. Come and see them, for they are everywhere once you start to look. Here are the minstrels, the wandering musicians with pipe and tabor and fiddle and harp, playing for the coins that the listeners toss, filling a corner of the common with music, while a knot of folk gathers to listen or to dance. Here are the tumblers and the acrobats, throwing their bodies through the air, walking on their hands, balancing and leaping, and contorting to the gasps of a ring of onlookers. Here is a juggler, keeping a flashing circle of knives or balls in the air. Here, perhaps, is a man with a dancing bear, the great shaggy beast led on a chain and made to shuffle and sway to a pipe, a sight that drew and thrilled a medieval crowd as few things could. And here is the fool and the trickster and the teller of tales and the quack with his table of marvellous cures, the salves and potions that would mend any ailment if you believed his patter, sold with a showman's flourish to the hopeful and the desperate. And here, in some open square of the common, there might be a play for the great religious plays, and the rough comic interludes were part of the life of the age. An affair was exactly the gathering, where players might set up and perform, drawing a crowd to laugh and weep and marvel at the old stories made flesh before them. All of this cost the watcher a coin or two, or nothing but the time to stand and gape, and all of it was part of why a person walked or rode for days to reach the festival. Not only for the pepper and the cloth, but for the music and the bear and the tumblers and the wonder, for the rare and precious chance to be amazed. The mart fed the spirit as well as the household. Now, threaded through all of this, the trade and the spectacle alike, ran something we have not yet spoken of, and to a medieval person it was never far from mind. Come and see the holy in the midst of the worldly. The festival was set within the frame of the church, as the whole of medieval life was set within it, and the marks of that were everywhere once you knew to look. The very timing of it was a holy timing, for the great marts were held at the seasons of the church, around the feast days of the saints, so that the calendar of trade and the calendar of devotion were one and the same, and a man knew when the season fell by knowing the feast it kept. And here at Stourbridge the holy root went deeper still, for the whole gathering had grown, as we have seen, from the charity of a leper hospital, and at the heart of the common, among the rows of timber and canvas, stood the small old stone chapel of St. Mary Magdalene, the one permanent and consecrated thing in all that temporary city. Come and stand by it a moment, in the lee of its old walls, while the trade roars on around it. There is something moving in the sight. The little chapel of the forgotten lepers, standing quiet and solid amid the loud impermanent wealth of the greatest fair in England. The holy stillness at the centre of the worldly storm, and the holy mingled with the worldly in ways both tender and dubious. The genuinely devout would hear Mass at the chapel before the day's dealing, would give alms to the poor and the few remaining sick, would do their business with the fear of God and the sin of false dealing somewhere in their minds. But where the pious gather, the sellers of false piety gather too, and the gathering drew its share of them. The pardoner worked the crowd, the man with his bag of pardons and his case of relics, offering remission of sins and the touch of a holy bone for a price, preying on the fears and hopes of simple folk, a figure the age both used and despised. The seller of cheap holy trinkets and pilgrim badges did a brisk trade, and the line between true devotion and mere superstition, between holy charity and holy fraud, ran right through the middle of the gathering, as it ran through the middle of the age. And a person walking the common past, from the real and the sacred to the false and the grasping and back again, without always being able to tell which was which. The mart held all of it, the prayer and the pardoner both, the chapel and the quack, and made no great effort to separate them. The pardoner deserves a longer look, for he was one of the most telling figures the fair drew, a man who came to sell the one thing more precious to a medieval soul than any spice: the easing of the fear of hell. Understand how heavily that fear lay on these people. They believed with their whole hearts in the pains of the world to come, in the long torment that awaited the sinful soul, and in the various means by which that torment might be shortened or escaped, through penance and prayer and the merits of the saints and the granting of pardons by the Church. And into that vast and anxious market stepped the pardoner, licensed in theory to grant the Church's indulgences in return for pious donations, but in practice, very often, a travelling salesman of salvation, working the credulous crowd with a showman's patter and a bag of dubious wares. He would have his relics, the holy bones and fragments, that carried, it was claimed, the power of the saints, a splinter said to be of the true cross, a bone said to be a martyr's, a scrap of cloth touched to something holy, displayed with great solemnity and offered for the veneration and the donation of the faithful. He would have his pardons, his written remissions of the penalties of sin, sold for coin to those desperate, to lighten the burden on their souls. It was a trade that the honest churchmen of the age despised even as the Church tolerated it. And the pardoner became one of the great figures of suspicion and satire, the very type of the holy fraud, the man who grew fat selling false comfort to the frightened poor. And yet the dealing flourished at the fair as everywhere, because the fear it preyed upon was real and deep and universal, and because the hope it sold, however dubious, was a hope people were desperate to buy. Alongside the pardoner stood the humbler sellers of holy things, the pilgrim badges and the little tokens and images, the cheap devotional wares that let an ordinary person carry a piece of the sacred home. And these did a steady, honest trade among the genuinely devout. The whole spectrum of medieval faith was there in the place, from the truest devotion to the rankest fraud, the pilgrim badge and the false relic side by side. The deep, real fear of God and the cynical selling of relief from it, all mixed together in the one crowd as they were mixed together in the one age. Now we have spoken of the goods and the dangers and the wonders and the faith. Let me draw it all together by looking at the people, at the whole astonishing range of them that the mart gathered in. I want you to stand still a moment in a busy lane and simply watch the folk go by, because the cast of the fair was the whole of medieval society, and there was no other place where you could see it all at once. Watch them pass. Here comes the great wholesale merchant, the man of real wealth, in his furred and trailing gown, who deals not in single cloths, but in entire cargoes, who buys to sell again, whose word is good for hundreds of pounds, and whose counting house may be in London or across the sea. Behind him, the steward of a great household, list in hand, grave and careful, here to provision a castle or a manor for the winter. The wine, the spice, the cloth, the salt fish, the wax, all the costly bulk that a lord's establishment swallowed, bought in one great campaign of purchasing at the autumn market. Then the substantial townsman, the draper or the mercer, come to buy his stock for the year, and his wife beside him with an eye as sharp as his. and down the scale they come, every rung of it. The yeoman farmer, prosperous in his way, here to sell his beasts and buy a few good things with the proceeds. The country goodwife, who has walked in from her village for the small treats and necessities of the 12-month, fingering a ribbon she will think about for an hour before she buys it. The scholar from the nearby university, perhaps, browsing among the parchment and the few precious books, or simply escaping his studies for the noise and colour of the common. The servant sent to buy, the apprentice on an errand, the labourer with a few pennies to spend on a pie and a wonder. And below them all, the poor, the beggars, working the crowd for charity, the ragged children, the lame and the blind, who took their place at the festival as they took it at the church door. For a gathering this rich was a harvest for the needy too. And moving among all of these, the strangers, the foreigners, the men of Flanders, and the Hanse and the Italian towns, with their unfamiliar speech and their costly wares, as exotic to the country folk as the spices they sold. The fair was a portrait of the age, every face in it painted in one crowded September afternoon. Now, to make all of this real, let me follow a single one of them through a single purchase, from the first glance to the sealed bargain, so that you can feel exactly how it went. Let us follow the steward, the careful man with the list, for his is the kind of buying the market was truly built for. He has come, let us say, to buy spice for his Lord's house against the coming feasts, and he means to buy well, for he will answer to his master for every penny and every ounce. Watch how he goes about it. He does not buy at the first booth. He walks the whole spice quarter first, slow and unhurried, looking and saying little, letting the sellers see that he is a man who knows his business and will not be hurried or fooled. He notes the prices cried, the quality shown, which dealers have the freshest pepper and the truest weights. Only then does he return to the stand he has marked, and the dance begins. The trader names his price, high and confident. The steward receives it with a small pained smile, as a man hearing something faintly absurd, and names his own, low enough to be an insult, were it not part of the game. The seller clutches his heart and speaks of his costs, the dangers of the road, the tolls he has paid, his own honest poverty. The steward weighs the pepper in his eye and finds fault, picks over the quality, mentions a better price he has seen 3 rows over, half turns to leave. The dealer calls him back. The numbers creep toward one another, offer and counter, each small surrender wrung out with a show of pain, until at last they meet at a figure both have known for some minutes they would settle on. And then the close, the weighing out, the steward watching the scales like a hawk, ringing the doubtful coin, checking the weight against the standard. The counting of the coin, or more likely for a man of his standing, the marking of a tally or the giving of his master's credit, to be reckoned later. And the clasp of hands, the slap of palm on palm, that seals it and makes it binding before God and the law of the fair. It is done. A small thing, one purchase among 10,000 that day, and yet in it is the whole machinery of the mart in miniature, the knowledge and the wariness and the ritual and the trust. The human art of turning goods into silver that this entire roaring city existed to perform. Now, having watched one quiet bargain up close, I want to step back from the goods and the dealing altogether, because there is far more to a mart than the buying and the selling, and some of the truest things about it we have not yet touched. Begin with the simple fact of how all these people came to be here at all, for the gathering of such a multitude on an empty common was itself a great undertaking, repeated along every road for days beforehand. They came from everywhere, by every means a medieval person had. The grand merchants travelled by horse and by river, their goods ahead of them in the barges. The country folk came on foot, walking in from the villages round about, a day's journey or 2 days, setting out before dawn with their small savings sewn into their clothes and their hopes high. The farmers arrived driving their beasts, the slow herds and flocks filling the lanes for miles around as the gathering drew near. The carriers rolled in with their laden carts, the pack trains following nose to tail. And along every track that fed toward the common, the traffic thickened steadily as the season opened, until the roads themselves became a kind of slow procession, all flowing toward the one bright point on the map. And there was an anticipation in that journey that we, who can have anything carried to our door in a day, can scarcely feel. For most who came, the fair was the great event of the year, planned for and saved for and looked forward to through all the long months of labour. The one time the wider world came within reach. A village family setting out for Stourbridge was setting out for the largest and most wonderful thing they would see all year, perhaps in their lives, and the walk in, footsore and excited. With the smoke of the gathering finally rising ahead and the murmur of it growing on the air, must have been a joy in itself, the joy of long anticipation about to be answered. They came hungry for it in every sense, and the fair did not disappoint. Now all these thousands had to sleep somewhere, and that was a problem, the like of which no village ever faced. So let me show you what became of them when the dark came down. Where did they all sleep? It is a question that hardly occurs to us, but it pressed hard on everyone who came. For the market gathered more people in one place than any town nearby could hold, and the matter of lodging was a real and anxious business. The nearby town of Cambridge filled to bursting, every inn and alehouse packed, every spare bed and barn floor let out for good money to those who could pay. The townsfolk turning their own homes into lodging houses for the season and reaping a fine harvest from the crowds. But Cambridge could not hold a tenth of them, and so most who came to the mart slept at the gathering, or near it, as best they could. The wealthier merchants slept in their own booths among their goods, both for want of anywhere better and to guard their stock through the dangerous night. Others slept in tents, pitched at the edges of the common, or in the wagons that had brought them, or simply rolled in a cloak under a cart or against a wall of canvas. Taking the autumn night as it came, the cook fires and ale booths that burned on after dark were partly for these, the great sleeping multitude of the gathering, with nowhere to go and nothing to do in the night hours but huddle near a fire and wait for the morning. It was rough lodging and cold, for September nights in the flat country by the river could be raw, and a person might wake stiff and damp with the dew. Having slept little among the noise and the strangers and the fear of thieves. But it was part of the fair, this great uncomfortable encampment of the night, and there was a kind of fellowship in it too. Thousands of strangers bedded down together under the open sky in the middle of an empty country, the fires burning low, the watch going by with its lanterns, the current sliding past in the dark. To sleep at the market was to be, for a few nights, part of a vast temporary community of the road and the common, and many who came remembered the nights almost as vividly as the days. Now among all these thousands, sleeping rough and trading hard, were people who had come from very far indeed, and they were a wonder in themselves. Come and meet the strangers from over the sea. The mart drew foreigners, and to the country folk who made up the bulk of the crowd, the foreigners were among the most marvellous sights of all. For the great traffic of the festival reached across the sea, and the men who handled that business came with it. The merchants of Flanders and the Low Countries, dealers in the fine cloths, the men of the Hunts, the great trading league of the northern German towns, who handled the furs and the tar and the goods of the Baltic, the occasional Italian, from the cities that ran the spice commerce and the banking of half of Europe, exotic and sharp and immensely rich. They came in their own clothes, cut in foreign fashions, and they spoke their own tongues, so that the lanes of the festival rang not only with English, but with snatches of Flemish and German and the languages of the South. A babble of speech that a country person had never heard in their life and could only marvel at. And these foreign merchants were not figures of fun, but figures of power, for they commanded the goods and the wealth that the whole fair turned upon, and they dealt with the great English merchants as equals or more in sums that dwarfed the little bargains of the crowd. To the watching countrymen, they were creatures from the edge of the known world, speaking in tongues, dressed in marvels, dealing in fortunes, living proof that the gathering on this Cambridgeshire common was somehow joined to lands he had only heard of in sermons and tales. The foreigner at the market was the world made visible, the distant places given a face and a voice, and the presence of these strangers from over the sea was one more thing that made the gathering feel like a window flung open onto a vastness that the village never otherwise glimpsed. Now I have spoken of merchants and farmers and scholars and foreigners, but I have not yet given proper place to half of the crowd, and it is a half too often left out of the telling. Turn now to the women of the mart. The market was full of women, and they were no mere onlookers, but a working, dealing, essential part of it, which may surprise those who imagine the medieval woman as forever shut indoors. They were here in every role. They were here as buyers above all, for the running of a household was women's work, and it was the good wife who knew what the home needed and who came to the mart to get it, who chose the cloth and the pots and the spices, who haggled as hard as any man over the price of what her family would use. They were here as sellers too, for many trades were wholly or partly in women's hands. The alewives who brewed and sold the ale that the whole festival drank were women almost to a one, and women dealt in foodstuffs and dairy and poultry and the small wares, and a widow might carry on her dead husband's trade and deal on the common in her own right and name. They were here as workers, the cooks and the servers and the spinners and the countless hands that a great gathering needed. And the fair offered a woman something it offered a man too, but that mattered more to her, because her ordinary world was so much more enclosed. A door out of it, a sanctioned reason to travel, to be abroad among the crowds, to see and be seen, to deal and decide and move through the wide, loud world on her own business. It came with its dangers, the same dangers the crowd held for anyone, and a particular danger besides. And a woman at the gathering kept her wits and her company about her. But come she did, in her thousands, and dealt, and bought, and sold, and brewed, and served, and gawped, and enjoyed, as much a part of the market as any man. And any picture of that crowd that leaves the women out is only half a picture. Now, where there were women and men and trade and holiday, there were also the young, and the mart, through a child's eyes, was a wonder almost beyond bearing. Come and find the children of the mart. For a child, the market was the most marvellous thing the whole year could hold, and the children came, carried on shoulders through the press or clutching a parent's hand, or running loose in pack with other children through the lanes. Think what it was to a child whose entire world was a small village. A few cottages and fields and the same faces always, to be brought suddenly into this, the noise, the colour, the crowds, the tumblers turning in the air, the bear, the music, the sweet things to eat, the marvellous goods piled high, the foreigners in their strange clothes, the whole roaring carnival of it. It must have been overwhelming and intoxicating, a memory to feed on for the rest of the year, and to tell the younger ones about by the winter fire. A child might be given a coin, a rare and precious thing, to spend as it chose, and the agonizing, delicious business of choosing a sweet, a toy, a ribbon, a gingerbread figure was a joy in itself. A child might be lifted to see over the crowd at the bear or the players, might taste sugar for the only time in a year, might gaze at the goldsmith's glittering table as at the treasure of a king. And the fair held dangers for the young, as well as delights, for a small child in so vast a throng could be lost in an instant, swept away in the press, and parted from its people. And the cry of a lost child was one of the sounds of the mart, and the terror of it one of a parent's chief fears. But mostly it was wonder, undiluted wonder, the kind that only the young can feel at full strength. And the festival gave it to them in abundance. To have been a child at the great gathering was to carry a kind of golden memory ever after, a glimpse, once a year, of how large and bright and strange the world could be. Now, the wonder of the child was only the sharpest form of something the grown country folk felt too, and I want to dwell on that for a moment, because it is the thing I would most want you to feel about the festival. Come and see the market through the eyes of someone seeing it new. Imagine you are an ordinary country person, a villager. Come to the great fair for the first time in your life. Your whole world until now has been a few square miles, the village and its fields, the parish church, the faces you have known since birth, the round of the seasons and the labour of the land. You have never seen more than a few hundred people in one place. You have never seen the sea, or a city, or a foreigner, or any building grander than your church. You have eaten the food your own land grew, and worn the cloth your own people wove, and the wider world has reached you only as rumour, as the words of a sermon or a passing traveller's tale. And now you walk in over the rise, and the mart opens out before you. And it is as though a door has been flung open onto the whole of creation. There is more wealth spread on this common than you knew existed at all. There are more people in one lane than in all the villages you have ever known together. There are spices that grew in lands, the priest says, lie near the edge of paradise, and furs from forests of eternal snow, and silks like woven light, and gold heaped on tables, and men speaking in tongues that mean nothing to your ear, and beasts and music and marvels at every turn. You walk through it stunned, your senses battered, your sense of the size of creation stretched and stretched again, and you understand, in a way no sermon could ever teach you, that the earth is vast and various, and full of things you had never dreamed. That was the deepest gift of the gathering, deeper than any bargain. For a few hours once a year, it took people whose lives were narrow by necessity and showed them the breadth of the world, and sent them home changed, carrying the knowledge of how large a place they lived in. We who drown in the whole world every day can hardly imagine what that single annual glimpse of it meant. To them, it was very nearly everything. Now, all that wonder needed feeding and watering and celebrating, for the market was a holiday as well as a marvel. So let me show you how they ate and drank and made merry. A mart was a feast, a break in the long, lean discipline of the working year, and the people who came meant to enjoy themselves, to eat and drink better than they did at home, and to throw off, for a few days, the hard sobriety of ordinary life. The food we have smelled in the cook rows was part of it, the pies and the roast meat, and the good things bought hot and eaten in the hand. Small luxuries to a people whose daily fare was plain. The ale was a great part of it, drunk far more freely than at home, and the wine for those who could reach it, so that the fair grew merrier and louder and warmer as the afternoon wore on and the cups went round. There was a license to it, a loosening, the holiday feeling that has always hung about a festival. The sense that for these few days the ordinary rules were softened, and a person might eat and drink and spend and laugh and dance in a way the rest of the year did not allow. And with the license came its shadow, the disorder that always follows where many people gather to make merry and the drink flows free. Tempers frayed and quarrels flared, and the fair court had its brawlers to judge. The loosening that made the gathering joyful made it riotous too, and the line between holiday and disorder was always thin and often crossed. The moralists of the age looked at the festivals and saw in them not only honest trade, but occasions of sin, of drunkenness and lechery and waste and brawling, and they were not wholly wrong. For the market gathered up all the appetites of human nature, along with all its commerce, and let them off the leash a little. But to the people who came, that loosening was half the point. A year of labour earned a few days of license, and they took them gladly, ate and drank, and made merry on the common while they could, knowing the hard, sober winter was coming soon enough. Now there is one last thing the gathering traded in that we have not named, and it was as valuable as any spice, though it cost nothing and weighed nothing at all. Let me tell you about the news. A mart was a meeting of distant places, and where the world meets, news travels, and to a society without any other means of spreading word across distances, that mattered enormously. Think of how isolated the ordinary medieval place was, how slowly word moved, how a village might know nothing of what passed beyond its own horizon for weeks or months together. The market broke that open. Here, gathered in one place, were people from every corner of the land and beyond it. Merchants who had been to London and the chief cities, sailors who had crossed the sea, travellers from far counties, foreigners from over the water, and every one of them carried news of wars and kings and battles, of prices and harvests, of plagues and weather, and the doings of the great, of all that had passed in the wider world, since last the country folk had any word of it. And so the fair hummed with talk as much as with trade, the news passing from mouth to mouth in the ale booths and along the lanes, the country folk drinking it in as eagerly as they drank the ale, carrying it home to their villages where it would be told and retold through the winter. A man might learn at the mart that the king had fought a battle, that a great lord had died, that the price of wool was rising, that a sickness was abroad in a distant county, that some marvel or scandal had befallen in the lands beyond the parish, and bring it all home as a kind of treasure, the news of the year, gathered at the autumn mart and parcelled out by the winter fire. The festival was the age's newspaper and its marketplace of word as much as of goods, the one place where the scattered fragments of a slow and silent age were brought together and exchanged, and that invisible trade in tidings was, in its way, as precious as anything sold on the common. Now, with all of that in your mind, the goods and the strangers and the wonder and the feasting and the news, let the whole sensory flood of the fair wash over you once more. For there is nothing in our world that is quite like it. Stand in the middle of it now, in the afternoon, with your eyes closed for a moment, and let the gathering pour in through every sense at once, because the sensory force of the place was a thing the people who came never forgot. And it is the hardest thing for us, in our muffled and managed world, to imagine. Begin with the sound, which never stopped and never softened. The criers above all, hundreds of them, each bawling his own wares over all the rest. a wall of competing human voices that pressed on the ears from every side. Under it, the endless music of the bargaining, the rise and fall of haggling voices, the slap of hands on deals, the beasts, lowing and bleating and squealing, and the gabble of geese, the minstrel's pipe and the tumbler's drum from the corners of spectacle, the ring of coins, the rumble of cartwheels, the shouts of the porters, the cry of a child lost in the crowd, the bark of dogs, the whole great roar of thousands of human beings packed into one field and all of them making noise, and the smell, layered and overpowering and inescapable, the wood smoke of 1,000 fires hanging over everything, the good smell of the cook rows, roasting meat and baking pastry threading through the rest, the warm reek of the beasts and their dung churned into the trodden ground, the sharp scents of the goods themselves, the tar and the pitch and the new timber, the saltfish, and over it, when the air moved right, the astonishing warm waft of the spices, pepper and cinnamon and clove carried on the breeze, the sweat of the huge crowd, the ale on the breath of the merry, the tallow and the leather and the wet wool, to a nose that lived in the clean, thin air of the open country. The fair was a thick wall of smell you walked into and were swallowed by. And the sight of it, the colour, for a world we tend to imagine in browns and greys, was in truth, on a day like this, a riot of colour to eyes starved of it. The dyed cloths hung out scarlet and blue and green, the painted signs, the bright booths, the rich gowns of the wealthy, the flash of the tumblers, the whole common ablaze of hue and movement under the September sky after the long sameness of the village year. Sound and smell and colour and the press of bodies all at once, all at full flood, that was the market. And a person who walked into it from a quiet life walked into the most intense few hours their senses would ever know. Now, all this wealth and wonder flowed through the festival, and a great deal of it stuck to certain hands on the way. Come and see where the money went. For all its noise and colour, a mart was first and last a machine for making money, and not only for the traders. The gathering itself was a property, an asset, a thing owned, and the owning of it was worth a great deal, because the market took its cut of everything that happened on the common. Think of all the tolls and dues we have brushed against as we walked. There was the toll on goods coming in, paid at the bounds. There was stallage. The rent paid for the ground, a stall stood on, so that every booth on the common, every one of those hundreds of pitches, paid for the grass beneath it. There was pickage, the fee for the very right to break the ground and drive in the posts to build your tent. There were tolls on the beasts sold, and dues on this and that, a whole careful structure of small extractions, each one modest in itself, that together, across the thousands of transactions of the season, added up to a very great sum indeed. And who took it all? There is the question that lay beneath the entire roaring surface of the fair, and the answer was tangled and much disputed, as the answer to such questions always is where money is concerned. The mart had been granted long ago to the lepers of St. Mary Magdalene, and the ghost of that grant lingered in the structure of who was owed what. But over the centuries the rights had been divided and disputed and fought over in the courts, claimed in their parts by the great priory nearby, by the town of Cambridge, by the university with its rights of oversight, each pulling toward itself as much of the lucrative business of the festival as it could grasp. The town and the university in particular were rivals of long and bitter standing, and the place was one of the richest bones they fought over, each claiming the right to govern this and toll that and judge the other. The wealth that the gathering generated, The cut it took from the trade of half of Europe was worth the fighting. And so, beneath the cheerful chaos of the common, ran a hard and ceaseless contest among the powerful over who should pocket its profits. The buying and selling was the fair's body. The struggle over its dues was the fair's hidden heart. But money and dues were not the only hard things the fair carried. For a gathering this size, built of timber and canvas and crowded with strangers, lived always within arm's reach of disaster. And I have not yet shown you its perils. The first and most dreaded of them was fire. Think of what this city was made of: dry timber, oiled canvas, straw and rope, and packed goods, raised close together in long rows, with cook fires and candles and lanterns burning among it from end to end. A single overturned brazier, a candle left by a sleeping man among the bales, a spark caught by the wind, and a whole row could be ablaze before anyone could draw water. The flames leaping from booth to shed faster than men could run. Fire was the terror that haunted every crowded medieval place, for there was no means to fight it worth the name. Only buckets and bare hands, and the desperate pulling down of what stood in its path. And a fire that got a hold in a packed and windy gathering could destroy in an hour what had taken weeks to build and ruin 100 traders at a stroke. So the watch watched for fire above all, and the wise trader kept water by his goods, and everyone carried in the back of the mind the knowledge that the whole bright city could go up in smoke between one breath and the next. It never quite left them, that fear, and it was the price of building a city out of things that burned. And there was a subtler terror than fire, one that the people of this particular century knew with a dreadful intimacy, and that was pestilence. For these were the decades after the Great Mortality, the plague that had swept through England a generation or so before our morning and carried off, by the most fearful reckonings, something near to half the folk of the land, emptying whole villages, piling the dead beyond the counting, leaving a scar on the mind of everyone who lived after. And the plague came back, again and again in lesser visitations, through the years that followed, so that the dread of it was never far away. Now think of a great fair in such an age. Thousands upon thousands of strangers packed body to body from every corner of the land, breathing the same air, drinking from the same cups, sleeping crowded in the same booths. A crowd was where the sickness spread. Everyone knew it in their bones. And a gathering was the greatest press a person ever stood in. There was a shadow over the joy of it. Then, for the watchful, the knowledge that this same press that made the market so wonderful was also exactly the thing that carried the pestilence, and that a man might bring home from the great mart something far worse than he had gone to buy. The mart gathered the country together, and gathering was both its glory and its danger. And in the back of the medieval mind, the two could never be wholly separated. There were gentler troubles too, the ordinary discomforts that the weather could heap on a city with no roof but canvas. We have walked the market on a fair day, dry and golden, but September in the flat country by the river was as often grey and wet, and a mart in the rain was a misery. The common turned to mud, churned by thousands of feet and hooves into a deep clinging mire that sucked at the shoes and splashed up the legs and made every lane a trial to cross. The rain came through the canvas and dripped into the booths, soaking the goods that could not be kept dry, ruining the cloth and spoiling the food and chilling the traders to the bone. The cook fires hissed and struggled, the crowd huddled and grumbled. And the whole bright business of the gathering went on regardless, because it had to, because the season was short and the goods must be sold rain or shine. So the traders stood in the wet and cried their wares to a sodden multitude. and the buyers picked their muddy way from booth to pitch, with their hoods up and their tempers short, and everyone longed for the sun. A wet market was the same gathering, but harder, colder, dirtier, and a great deal less merry. And the people who came took their chances with the September sky as they took their chances with everything else. Now, let me turn from the troubles to the pleasures again, for there was one kind of market amusement I have not yet named, and the moralists liked it least of all. Wherever the medieval crowd gathered with coins in their purses and time on their hands, there was gambling, and the mart was no exception. The games of chance came to the festival as surely as the cut purses did, and for much the same reason, drawn by the loose coin and the holiday mood. There were dice above all, the great vice of the age, easy to carry and quick to play, and ruinous to the unlucky, and a man might wager away in an afternoon's throwing what he had taken a year to save. There were games of skill and games of chance, and games that pretended to be the one while being the other, run by sharp men who knew the odds and the tricks far better than the countrymen they fleeced. There was wagering on contests, on a wrestling match or a feat of strength or a race, the crowd betting hot among themselves. The fair, in its holiday license, was a paradise for the gamester, and many a man who came with his harvest money in his purse went home with it, gone, lost on the fall of a die, in a tent on the common. And many a sharp man made his fair's living not by selling anything at all, but by relieving the foolish of their silver across a gaming board. The moralists thundered against it, and the fair court punished the worst of the cheats. But the dice rattled on regardless, for the appetite for a wager is older than any law, and the place gave it the fullest scope. Now, let me turn from the appetites of the mart to its machinery, to the careful and clever mechanisms that made all this trade possible at all, and that we have only glimpsed in passing. Consider first the matter of money, which was far more tangled in the medieval world than the simple handing over of coins we imagine. The coin of the realm was silver, the penny and its halves and quarters, and there was never quite enough of it, and what there was could be clipped at the edges, or worn smooth, or counterfeited, or honestly foreign and strange. A gathering that drew traders from across the sea, drew their coin with them, the moneys of Flanders and France, and the German towns and the Italian cities. None of it lawful tender here, and all of it needing to be valued and exchanged before it could be spent. And so the mart had its money changers, men who sat with their scales and their knowledge of the world's coin, and made a living from the turning of one money into another, weighing the foreign silver, reckoning its worth against the English penny, taking their cut of every exchange. They were the bankers of the common, and the great merchants leaned on them, for international trade could not happen without the means to turn one realm's money into another's. To watch a money changer at work, weighing a handful of strange coins on his small precise balance and naming their worth in English silver, was to see one of the quiet essential gears of the whole machine. The thing that let the wealth of different lands flow together on one field. And over all the dealing stood the great apparatus of regulation, the assize, the system by which the market tried to keep its trade honest. We have seen the officers and the proctors testing weights and breaking the false ones, and that was only a part of it. There were the standard measures, the true yard and the true bushel and the true pound kept by the authorities, against which any seller's measure could be checked. So that a cloth sold by the yard was sold by a yard that meant the same to all. There was the assize of bread and ale, the ancient regulation of the price and the measure and the quality of the two great staples, so that the loaf and the cup a man bought at the market were of a fixed and known standard, and the baker or the brewer who cheated could be caught and punished. And the punishments were public and shaming, for that was the medieval way, the stocks and the pillory, set up in an open place where the crowd could see and jeer. The false trader fixed in them, with his false goods displayed beside him or hung about his neck, the cheating baker drawn through the mart on a hurdle with his light loaf for all to mock. Justice at the fair was meant to be seen, a lesson written in shame upon the body of the cheat, a warning to all the rest. And the sight of a man in the stocks with rotten fruit thrown at him was as much a part of the place as the spices and the bear. It is worth understanding, too, that this fair did not stand alone, but was one stop on a great wheeling round of gatherings that turned through the whole year. The merchants who came here did not stay home the rest of the 12-month. They followed the markets from one great market to the next, across England and over the sea, for the marts were timed in a sequence, each at its own season, so that a trader could carry his goods from one to the next in a long circuit that filled the 12-month. There were the great marts of England and the famous fairs of the continent, all linked in a calendar that the trading world knew by heart, and a merchant's life was lived along that circuit, arriving, selling, settling debts to be paid at the next season down the line, moving on. So the man you saw dealing in the cloth row here in September might be met again in the spring at a gathering 100 miles away or over the water, and the debt struck here might be discharged there. The whole commerce of the age bound together into one vast turning wheel of gatherings, of which this roaring city on the Cambridgeshire Common was one bright spoke. To come to Stourbridge was to step into a current that ran far beyond it, out across the country and the sea, through a full year and a wide world of fairs. And in the end, when you have understood the goods and the money and the law and the calendar, the mark comes back to the people, to the enormous range of human lives it gathered for its few bright weeks. I have shown you many of them, but let me set the two ends of it side by side one last time before we feel the turning of the season. At the one end stands the great merchant, the prince of the trade, rich beyond a countryman's imagining, dealing in cargoes and credit, at home in London and Bruges and Cologne, for whom the market is a stop on a circuit and a chance at a fortune, who sleeps guarded among his bales and reckons his takings in the hundreds of pounds. And at the other end stands the poorest visitor, the ragged labourer, or the village child, or the beggar at the edge of the crowd, who has walked in with a few pennies or none, for whom the market is the one marvel of the year, who buys a pie and a wonder if anything at all, and goes home with empty hands but a full heart, having seen, for a day, the width and the wealth of a world that will never be his. Between those two ends ran every gradation of the medieval condition, the whole ladder of it, from the prince of trade to the wide-eyed pauper, and the mart held them all on the one stretch of grass, under the one September sky, for the one brief season. There has never been a fuller portrait of an age than the crowd at a great fair. Now, with all of that held in your mind, let us step back at last and feel the season itself. We have stepped back now from the money and the multitudes, and the time of year was no accident, and it shaped the whole feeling of the day. Lift your eyes from the rose for a moment and notice the sky and the air, because this was a September mart. And September in England has a particular quality that hung over the entire common and coloured the mood of everyone in it. The high summer is gone. The light has turned, grown lower and more golden, slanting long across the common in the mornings and the evenings. There is a coolness in the air that was not there a month ago, a first edge of the autumn to come, and the leaves on the trees along the river have begun, here and there, to turn. It is the hinge of the year, the turn from the warmth and plenty of summer toward the cold and want of winter. And a medieval person felt that turn in their bones in a way we cushioned against the seasons, can barely feel at all. And the timing was everything, for September was chosen as the time of the great fair, precisely because it was the season of the harvest and its aftermath. The corn was in, or coming in, the year's hard labour of the fields just finished or finishing, and with the harvest gathered there was, for a brief golden moment, both produce to sell and a little money to spend, and a pause in the unceasing work of the land. It was the natural moment for the countryside to come together to trade, to turn the summer's increase into the things the winter would need, to lay in stores and settle accounts and reckon up the year before the dark months closed in. And so the market sat at the very pivot of the agricultural year, gathering up the harvest's wealth and redistributing it, the vast clearinghouse where the country turned its summer labour into its winter survival. There was a poignancy in it that the people felt. The brightness and bounty of the gathering set against the knowledge of the hard season coming. The last great mart and feasting and spending before the world drew in and went cold. The September light lay over the common like a kind of farewell. Now, the afternoon is wearing on toward evening, and the season, like the year, is beginning its turn toward an ending. But the day is not quite done with us yet. Not all the selling at the fair was done from the fixed booths in their ordered rows, and I want you to notice the other kind of seller, the one who came to you, weaving through the crowd, in every gap and corner the booths left, moved the petty traders, the hawkers and the chapmen and the tray sellers, the small itinerant merchants who carried their whole stock about their necks and bodies and cried it through the press. These were the lowest rung of the trading world, the men and women too poor or too modest to take a booth and pay its rents, who made their living instead by mobility and persistence, moving among the mass with their trays of pins and ribbons and trinkets and sweetmeats, their packs of minor wares, pressing their goods on the passing throng. The chapman was a figure of the open road as much as the fair, the travelling peddler who carried light manufactured goods out to the villages that had no shops, and at the market he was in his element, working the densest crowd in the land. There were the sellers of food on the move, the piemen and the criers of hot drinks and roasted nuts, crying their wares through the lanes. There were the ballad sellers, hawking their printed or remembered songs. There were the beggars, working the same throng from the other direction, and the tricksters with their quick games, and the whole shifting population of petty opportunists that any rich gathering drew. They gave the mart much of its restless human texture, these mobile traders, the cries and the pressing and the constant small commerce that filled the spaces between the serious dealing of the booths. And a person standing still in the lanes was never long unapproached, for someone was always coming with something to sell. They were the small change of the fair's great commerce, weaving their petty trade into every gap the stands left open. We have walked the festival almost entirely as buyers, drifting from stall to stand with a buyer's eye. And I want to turn that around for a moment and show you the day from the other side of the board, from where the seller stood, because his festival was a very different thing. For the trader, this was not a holiday, but the hardest and most important stretch of his working year, the few weeks on which his whole livelihood might turn. He had brought his goods here at cost and risk and labour, carried them by cart and barge over long distances, paid his tolls and his stallage and his pickage for the right to stand and sell. And he had only the brief season of the fair to turn that stock into profit before he must pack up and move on. So his days were long and anxious. He rose before dawn to make ready, stood at his booth through all the hours of daylight, crying his wares till his voice cracked, haggled and reckoned, and watched his goods against the thieves, and lay down at night among his stock, too tired to do more than guard it. A good market could make his year, a bad one, a wet season, or a slow trade, or a run of sharp buyers, could ruin him. Behind every cheerful cry in the rows was a man with everything riding on the next bargain. And the mart that was a wonder to the visitor was, to the trader, a high-stakes labour performed under pressure for weeks on end. It is worth remembering, as we drift among the marvels, that for the people who made the marvels possible, it was simply work and hard work, and the difference between a comfortable winter and a hungry one. And it is worth lifting our eyes too, from this one fair to the larger pattern it belonged to, because marts like this were not a curiosity, but a necessity, one of the central engines of the medieval economy. And understanding why tells you much about the age. In a world of poor roads and slow travel and scattered settlement, of small isolated communities that produced mostly what they consumed, the problem of how goods moved, how the wool of one place reached the weavers of another, and the wine of the south reached the tables of the north, was a deep and difficult one. The fair was the medieval answer. By gathering buyers and sellers from a vast region into one place at one time, it solved the problem of distance and dispersal at a stroke, creating, for a few weeks, a market large and rich enough to make long-distance trade worth the trouble. The merchant who would never travel to sell to scattered villages would gladly come to a market where the region's custom was concentrated. The household that could not send to a dozen distant sources would find them all assembled on one common. The mart was a great periodic concentration of trade, a way of overcoming the friction of a slow and scattered world by gathering it briefly into one bright, efficient knot. And the prosperity of whole regions could hang on the success of their fairs. This was not entertainment dressed as commerce. This was the circulatory system of a whole economy, beating once a year on a Cambridgeshire common. And then, when it was all over, when the buying was done and the booths were coming down, the people went home, and the journey home was its own quiet chapter that I would not leave out. They went back the way they had come, along the tracks and the droveways and the rivers, but changed. For they carried the fair with them now in the form of all they had bought. The country family walked home footsore under the weight of their purchases. The new pot and the bolt of cloth and the paper of pins and the barrel of salt fish, the small treasures and the necessary stores that would serve them through the year to come. The steward's carts rolled away, laden with the great house's winter provision. The merchant turned toward the next festival on his circuit, his stock lighter and his purse heavier, or the reverse if the season had gone ill. And as they went, the talk was all of the market, of what had been seen and bought and heard, of the bargains and the marvels and the news, the whole bright experience already turning, even on the road home, into the memory and the story it would remain for the rest of the year. The gathering released them as it had gathered them, sending them back to their scattered lives, carrying its goods and its tidings out into all the country round. So that the wealth and the word that had flowed into the common now flowed out again through 1,000 homeward journeys, into every village and household for miles about. Now, a few last textures of the fair, before the day turns. There are a few textures of the season I have not given you, the small sensory truths that made it what it was. And I want to fold them in before the day ends. Think first of how the crowd looked, of the sheer visual variety of the people in it. For clothing in this age was a language, and the mart gathered every dialect of it into one place. A person's dress told you, at a glance, almost everything: their station, their trade, their wealth, their origin, for what you might wear was fixed as much by law and custom as by purse. And the fine furs and rich dyes and costly cloths of the great were forbidden, in theory, to the low. So the crowd was a moving chart of the whole society: the merchant in his long furred gown of good dark wool, the lady in her bright dyed cloth and her headdress, the prosperous townsfolk in their respectable colours, the country folk in the plain, undyed wool and rough weave of their making, the labourers in their patched and faded homespun, the clergy in their black, the scholars in their distinctive garb, the foreigners in their outlandish foreign cut, bright and drab, fine and coarse, the entire spectrum of cloth and colour and rank jostled in the lanes, and a sharp eye could read the standing of everyone it passed. After the sameness of a village, where everyone dressed much alike in the same plain stuff, the sheer variety of the fair crowd was itself a spectacle, a parade of every kind of person, the age contained. Think next of the food. For I gave the cook rows only a passing breath, and they deserve a fuller one, since eating was one of the chief pleasures of a fair day. The smell of it, as I said, followed you everywhere. But consider what was actually on offer to the hungry walker with a coin to spend. There were the pies above all, the pastry coffins filled with whatever was in season, and cheap minced meat, or eel, or apple, or pear, baked in their hundreds, and sold hot to be eaten in the hand. There was roast meat, turned on spits over the fires, carved off in gobbets for those who could pay for flesh. There was pottage, the thick boiled stew of grains and vegetables, and what scraps of meat there were, the everyday food of the poor, ladled steaming into a bowl. There were the sweet things that made a child's eyes shine, the gingerbread and the honeyed cakes and the candied fruits, rare treats bought once a year. There were apples and nuts in their autumn plenty, and cheese and good bread and the ale to wash it all down. To eat at the fair was to eat better and more freely than at home, to taste meat and spice and sweetness that the daily round seldom offered. And the memory of a fair day was, for many, partly a memory of its flavours, the one feast in a year of plain fare. Now, come back among the beasts with me for a moment, for the great livestock trade had its own kind of people, and I gave them too little of their due. The beasts did not walk to the gathering by themselves. They were brought, often from far away, by the drovers. And the drovers were a hard and particular breed, whose trade deserves a word. To drive a herd of cattle or a flock of sheep across many days of country to a distant market was a skilled and demanding labour. The patient movement of difficult animals along the tracks and droveways, keeping them together, keeping them fed and watered, keeping them from straying or breaking, defending them from thieves for many days and many miles. The drovers knew the long green ways across the country, the old routes worn by generations of driven beasts, and they followed them from the rearing grounds in the hills and the wild country to the fat markets of the lowlands and the busy fairs. They arrived weathered and dusty, their beasts footsore, and sold their charges into the autumn trade. And they were a link, these hard-travelling men, between the distant breeding country and the great markets, a vital and unglamorous part of the machine that fed the country. And where there were beasts, there were dogs, the working dogs of the drovers and the shepherds, and the guard dogs set to watch the goods, and the strays that any large gathering of people and food drew in, so that the mart had its undercurrent of barking and snarling, and the quick movement of dogs through the legs of the crowd. These were the textures of the festival, the look and the taste and the company of it. And I did not want you to leave without them. There is a thread I want to draw out a little further before the day ends, and it is the one we began with, the thread of charity and faith that ran from the very root of the mart. Remember that all this wealth had been granted, in the beginning, for the relief of the lepers, and that the small stone chapel at the heart of the common was the living sign of it. By our 14th century morning, the lepers themselves had nearly all gone, for the dreadful sickness that had filled such houses was fading from the land, and the hospital that had once sheltered the outcast stood reduced and quiet, its old purpose worn thin. But the principle that a great worldly gathering should pour some of its wealth into the lap of mercy did not vanish with them. The fair remained in its bones, a thing that belonged to the church and to charity. Its profits still tangled up with pious uses, its season still set by the calendar of the saints, its heart still marked by that consecrated chapel standing patient among the booths. The genuinely devout came to it as to a holy day, as well as a market, heard mass before they dealt, gave alms to the poor, who gathered thick at so rich a gathering, and carried their faith into their bargaining, or tried to. The festival was worldly to its fingertips, full of greed and cheating and appetite, and yet it never wholly shook off the sacred frame it had been born in, and there is something fitting in that, in a place of such hard commerce keeping, at its centre, a small, quiet house of God, and the memory of the forgotten sick it had first been meant to serve. I want, too, to step back for a moment from the market itself and let you feel the strangeness of it across the gulf of years, because it is easy to walk through the past as though it were merely our own age in older clothes, and it was not. Think how alien this gathering would seem to us, and we to it. To us, a world where anything can be had at any hour, carried to the door in a day from the far side of the earth, the fruits of every land always at hand, the whole globe's goods reduced to a small and constant convenience. To such people as we are, the idea that the wonders of the earth came near only once a year, in a few roaring weeks on a muddy field, and that you walked for days to reach them and might wait a whole year for the next chance, is almost impossible to feel from the inside. And to them, our age would seem a kind of mad enchantment, a place where the marvels they crossed counties to glimpse lie heaped and ignored, where no one need ever gather, where the rare is made cheap and the far made near, and the wonder, in consequence, has mostly drained away. They had little, and so the fair was everything. We have everything, and so we have perhaps lost the mart. There is no simple lesson in that, but it is worth feeling. The distance between a world where abundance was a yearly miracle and a world where it is the dull condition of every hour. And now, with all of that held, let me give you the whole shape of the fair's long day once more, the rhythm of it from end to end, so that you carry it entire as you drift toward sleep. It began in the cold and the dark before dawn, the traders rising stiff among their goods, the cook fires being kindled, the first carts creaking in, the city stirring while the mist still lay on the river. It woke with the proclamation and the ringing bell, the mart switching from a waiting field into a living town, the first cries going up, the first coins changing hands. It filled through the morning, the lanes thickening, the bargaining rising, the crowd pouring in over the rise and through the bounds, until by the middle of the day it reached its full roaring flood, the greatest press of people any of them would ever know. It blazed through the afternoon at full pitch, all trade and noise and wonder, the spices and the cloth and the horses and the bear, the whole world's goods changing hands under the September sun. And then, as the light went golden and low, it began its long, slow turn toward evening, the cries growing hoarse, the crowd thinning, the deals winding up, the mood softening from sharp commerce into the warmer ease of the ale booths and the firelight. And after the dark came down, it lived on a while in a quieter, stranger form. The islands of firelight in the great blackness, the music and the drinking and the watch going by, until at last even that sank into the silence of the sleeping common. That was the shape of the fair's long day, dawn to dark, and we have walked the whole of it together. But before the day turns toward its ending, there are a few more corners of the fair I want you to feel, the ones that the wonder and the wealth tend to crowd out of the telling. And the first of them is the plain physical reality of what it was to put so many thousands of bodies on a single field for weeks on end. We have smelled the spices and the cook fires, but there was another side to the smell of the festival, and an honest walk through it cannot leave it out. Thousands of people and beasts, gathered on a common with no drains and no privies worth the name, made the ground a foul place by any reckoning of ours. The lanes between the booths were churned with mud and dung and the leavings of the crowd, and the edges of the gathering, the ditches and the unregarded corners, served the needs that nature pressed on so great a multitude, so that a powerful reek of human and animal waste hung about the market beneath all the finer scents. The refuse of the cook rows was thrown down where it fell. The beasts fouled their quarters. The rain, when it came, turned all of it to a stinking mire underfoot. We must not be too delicate about this, because the people of the time were not. They lived closer to dirt and smell than we can easily stomach, and a degree of filth that would empty a modern street was simply the texture of life to them, hardly remarked. But it was there, and it was part of the fair, and the bright pictures we make of the past are truer for admitting it. The same crowd that was a wonder was also a sanitary trial, and the same press of bodies that made the gathering so alive made it, by the end of a long dry spell or a wet week, a rank and dirty place to stand. That, too, is what it was really like, and a country person walking home tired at the day's end carried the smell of the mart in their clothes, along with its marvels in their head. Now, let me wash that away with something sweeter, for woven through all the dirt and the din was a thread of pure delight that I have not given its due. Let me tell you about the music and the dancing. I named the minstrels in passing, but music was far more than a corner of the gathering. It ran through the whole of it and rose up as the day wore on and the ale went round, into something like joy. There was music for the listening, the skilled players with their pipes and tabors and fiddles and harps, performing for the coins of a gathered ring, the singers with their long ballads and their bawdy songs and their tales set to a tune. And there was music for the dancing, which was the great release of a mart, for when the serious business eased and the drink loosened the limbs, the people danced in rings and lines, and the rough, vigorous dances of the country, on whatever patch of trodden grass would serve, to the playing of whoever could keep a tune going. To a people whose lives were hard and whose pleasures were few, the dancing at a market was a precious thing, a letting go, a few hours of bodily joy snatched from the long discipline of the year. The young especially seized it, for a mart and its dancing was one of the few places the youth of scattered villages could meet and look at one another and court a little under the loosened holiday rules. And many a match was first struck up in the music and the firelight of a festival. The dancing and the music were the fair's heart at play, and the sound of a pipe and the stamp of feet on the common at dusk was as much the fair as any bargain struck in the rows. Now, lift your eyes from the common itself, and let me show you how astonishingly far its reach extended. For the goods on these tables had travelled distances that should make us marvel. Stand among the booths and think about where everything around you had come from, and the gathering becomes a kind of map of the whole known world, drawn in goods. The pepper and the spices had come, as I said, from the far side of the world, from the Indies beyond all the lands the English knew, carried west by Arab and Italian hands across seas and deserts, to the ports of the Mediterranean and up through Europe. The silk had travelled from even further, by roads that ran clear to the edge of the imaginable. The furs and the tar and the timber and the iron had come down out of the cold north and east, from the Baltic shores and the great forests, in the ships of the Hanseatic towns to the port of Lynn. The wine had come up from Gascony in the south of France, the fine cloth from Flanders just across the narrow sea, and all of it, every strand of that vast web, converged on the same point. The port of Lynn at the mouth of the Ouse, where the sea roads met the river roads, and then up the inland water, barge by barge, mile by patient mile. To this common by the Cam, the fair was the inland knot, where all those threads tied together. The place where the trade of the Baltic, and the dealing of the Mediterranean, and the traffic of the Atlantic coast all came to rest on one English field. To buy here was to reach, through all those linked hands and waters, out to the very ends of the earth, and a person standing in the rows stood, without moving, at a crossing point of the whole world's commerce. Now, all of this had to live somewhere when it was not on the common, and it lived cheek by jowl with a real town that the gathering both enriched and overwhelmed. Let me tell you about Cambridge and its festival. The town of Cambridge stood close by, and its relationship with the great market on its doorstep was a tangled thing, equal parts blessing and burden and bitter rivalry. For a few weeks each year, the gathering swelled the little town beyond all its ordinary bounds, filling its inns and its streets and its purses, bringing a flood of custom and coin that the townsfolk reaped as eagerly as they could. But it overwhelmed the town too, packing it past, bursting, straining everything, bringing crime and disorder and disease along with the wealth, so that Cambridge both longed for its mart and was half drowned by it every autumn. And around the governing of the festival, and above all, around the lucrative right to regulate it and toll it and take from it, ran a bitter three-cornered contest that shaped the life of the place for centuries. There was the town of Cambridge, claiming its rights. There was the great priory nearby, with its own ancient claims. And there was the university, that growing power of scholars and masters, which the kings had armed with rights of oversight at the fair. The policing of weights and measures and the assize, rights that the town fiercely resented as an intrusion into its own affairs. Town and university were rivals in everything, their quarrels sometimes spilling into real violence in the streets, and the place was one of the richest and sorest of the bones they fought over, each pulling for as large a share as it could grasp of the wealth and the authority. So beneath the cheerful chaos of the common ran this hard contest of powers, the town and the priory and the university each reaching for the gathering. A struggle over money and right and precedence that was as much a part of the fair's true nature as anything sold in its rows. Now, come and feel the mart begin to wind down, for the long day is finally turning toward its end. The change comes gradually, the way the end of any long day comes, so that you hardly notice it beginning. The light has gone golden and low, slanting down the lanes between the booths and throwing lengthening shadows across the trodden grass. The cries of the sellers, which roared without pause through the middle of the morning, have grown a little fewer and a little hoarser. For a man can only bawl his wares for so many hours before his voice gives out. The greatest press of the crowd has begun, almost imperceptibly. to thin, as those who came only for the daylight turn for home while the light holds, not wanting to be caught on the roads after dark. The deals that were going to be done today are mostly done, and over the whole common there settles, by degrees, a different and quieter mood. A tiredness that comes at the end of a great effort, the winding down of a thing that has been at full pitch since dawn. Walk the lanes now and feel it. The buyers who remain move more slowly, their purses lighter and their bundles heavier. Their early sharpness softened into the pleasant weariness of a day well spent. The sellers begin to reckon up, to count what they have taken and what they have left, to think of the supper and the rest they have earned. Here and there a stall is already quieting, its goods half packed, its owner done for the day. The cook rows do a last brisk trade, for the tired and the hungry want, feeding before the road home or the night ahead. The ale booths fill, for the day's work being mostly over, the drinking can begin in earnest, and the sound of the fair shifts from the sharp competing cries of business to the lower, warmer, more ragged noise of people at their ease, laughing and singing and arguing over their cups. The market is loosening its belt. The hard business of the daylight is giving way to the softer business of the evening, and there is a sweetness in that hour. The same sweetness as the end of any hard and satisfying day, when the work is behind you and the rest is ahead. Now, the fair did not simply stop when the sun went down. Come and see what became of it in the dark. For the mart lived on after nightfall, though it was a changed and stranger place once the light was gone. Remember that this was a city without permanent buildings, a town of canvas and timber set down on open grass, and the night came to it total and black in a way we can scarcely imagine, for there was no light anywhere but fire and the moon. The booths shut up as best they could, their goods locked away or guarded, for a city full of wealth and strangers was a fearful thing to leave untended in the night, and the more valuable the stock, the more carefully it was watched. With men set to sleep among the bales and the spices, one hand on a cudgel. The watch went about the lanes, the fair's own guards charged with keeping its peace through the dangerous hours. Their lanterns small moving points of light in the great blackness of the common, and where the day had been all trade, the night was given over to other things. The ale booths and the cook fires burned on, islands of light and warmth in the gloom, and around them the fair's evening life gathered, the drinking and the singing and the telling of tales. The players and the minstrels earning their coin from a looser and merrier crowd, the whole holiday license of the fair coming out as the sober business of daylight faded. It was a time of pleasure and a time of danger, both. For the dark and the drink that made the festival merry made it perilous too, loosening tempers and hands alike. And the cut-purse and the brawler and worse did their work in the shadows between the booths where the watch could not see. A wise stranger kept to the lit places and to good company, and did not wander the unlit lanes alone with a full purse. But for those who stayed by the fire, the market by night had a magic the daylight lacked, the warmth and the dark and the firelight and the music, the sense of a great company gathered against the night in the middle of an empty country, and it was one more of the things that people walked for days to find. Now, the festival I have shown you ran for weeks, not one day, and all things must end. Let me take you to its ending. For at last the season closed. A gathering could not run forever. Its charter granted it so long a span, and no more. And as that span ran out, the great fair began, in earnest now, to come apart. The thinning that we felt in the evening grew, over the fair's final stretch, into a steady ebbing, the crowds growing smaller, the deals fewer, the goods sold down, until there came the day when the trading was truly over and there was nothing left to do but go. And then began the strangest sight of the whole strange life of the gathering, the unmaking of the city. Come and watch it, for there is nothing quite like it. The booths came down, all of them, the hundreds upon hundreds of them. The entire ordered city of timber and canvas that had risen on the common was now taken to pieces by the same hands that had raised it. The canvas was struck and folded, the boards unnailed and stacked, the posts drawn up out of the holes they had been driven into. The whole fabric of the place, dismantled plank by plank and pole by pole, and loaded onto the carts and the barges that had brought it. The goods that were left went with it, and the merchants went settling their last accounts, paying their last dues, turning at last for home, for London, for the coast, for the towns and ports of England and the harbours across the sea. The beasts that were not sold were driven away. The players and the minstrels followed the crowd to wherever the next fair or the next great gathering would be. Little by little, the common emptied, the rows growing gap-toothed and then bare, the noise fading, the great roar of the mart dying away to the sound of hammers and carts and a few last voices, and then to nothing. And then it was gone. The last cart rolled away up the track, the last barge slipped down the river, and the common lay empty under the autumn sky, a wide stretch of trampled, rutted, littered grass, scarred with the bare rectangles where the booths had stood and the dark holes where the posts had been, strewn with the rubbish of a vast crowd, smelling of smoke and dung and trodden earth. And that was all. The greatest fair in England, the trading heart of half the country, the gathering of the wealth of the world, was simply gone, struck and folded and carted away, leaving nothing behind but a marked and weary field and a small old stone chapel, standing quiet where the lepers had once been. In a few weeks the rains would come and wash the field, and the grass would begin to grow back over the scars, and the cattle would return to graze, and by the deep of winter you could have stood on that common and never known that anything had been there at all. Only the chapel remained, and the memory, and the certain knowledge that next September, when the harvest was in and the light turned golden again, the carts would come back, and the city would rise once more out of the empty grass, exactly as it had done for hundreds of years and would do for hundreds more. Now, with the gathering gone and the field bare, let me draw all of this together before we let the day go and sink towards sleep, before we draw the last lesson from the empty field. There are a few matters about the mart I hurried us past in the rush of the day, and I do not want you to leave without them, for they are part of the truth of the place. Think first of how the city came to be standing there at all on the morning we arrived, for we found it already built, the rows already raised, and never saw the labour that made it. A fair did not assemble itself. In the days before the season opened, the empty common filled with a different kind of crowd, the builders and the carters and the traders' men, who came to raise the temporary city out of nothing. The carts rolled in laden with timber and canvas and rope, the same materials that would be carried away again at the end. And the work of building began. Posts were driven into the turf in their hundreds, the lines of them laid out by men who knew the plan of the festival as well as their own names. For the rows fell in the same places year after year, and the regular traders kept the same pitches. Frames were raised on the posts, and roofed and walled with canvas or with boards, and the booths took shape one after another down the marked lanes until the grid of streets stood complete on the grass where a week before there had been only grazing. It was a great labour, the raising of the city, and a skilled one. For these were real structures meant to keep out the weather and hold valuable goods and stand for weeks against the autumn winds, not mere tents thrown up anyhow. And there was something marvellous in it, the building of a whole town in a matter of days on an empty field, the streets and squares appearing as if by some patient magic, ready to receive the wealth of the world. Then the goods came up the river and along the roads and were carried into the finished booths, and the traders settled into their pitches, and the city stood waiting, built and stocked and silent, for the proclamation that would bring it to life. We arrived to find it ready, but hold in your mind now the picture of it being made, the posts going in and the canvas going up, and the bare common becoming, day by day, a city, because it is the necessary twin of that other picture, the striking down at the end and the two of them together, the raising and the raising are the deepest truth of what the fair was. Now, there is a trade I named only in passing and ought to have lingered on, for it warmed the hearts of half of England. I told you the wine came up the river, but I did not stop at the wine, and it deserves a stop. For the wine trade was one of the great trades of the age and one of the most welcome at any gathering. The wine was mostly Gascon, the red wine of the English-held lands around Bordeaux in the south of France. Shipped in huge quantity to England every year and beloved by everyone who could afford it. It came in its wooden casks, the tuns and the pipes and the hogsheads, heavy and round, shipped across the sea to the ports and then up the rivers by barge, the same long water road that brought the spice and the fur, to be set down here on the common and sold to the taverners and the stewards and the prosperous men who would drink it through the coming winter. Wine was the drink of celebration and of status, a step above the everyday ale, and a household that could lay in a few casks of good Gascon red at the autumn fair counted itself fortunate. The wine seller's quarter had its own character, the enormous casks ranged and broached, the buyers tasting from the bung, the haggling over a vintage and a price, the careful loading of the bought casks onto the carts for the journey home. And behind every cask lay the same long story as behind the pepper, the vineyards of a distant land, the press and the cask, the ship across the sea and the barge up the river, the whole patient machinery of trade that brought the warmth of the southern sun to an English winter table, by way of a Cambridgeshire common. Now, I have spoken of wool as the foundation of England's wealth, but I went by it quickly, and it was too important for that. So come back to it with me a moment. England floated on wool, I said, and it is worth understanding why, and what it meant that this mart sat at the heart of the wool country. The sheep of England, by the million, grew a fleece finer than almost any in Europe, and that wool was the great treasure of the realm, wanted above all by the weavers of Flanders and Italy, whose looms turned it into the finest cloth in the world. For centuries the trade had run that way, the raw English wool shipped overseas to be woven by foreign hands and sold back, at a vast markup, as finished cloth. The wealth that came from it built the great wool churches of England, those huge and glorious parish churches in the wool counties, far grander than a village had any need of, raised on the profits of the fleece. It filled the king's treasury, for the tax on wool exports was one of the crown's chief revenues, the thing that paid for its wars, and in the years around our mourning, a mighty change was working through it. For the English were learning at last to weave their own wool into their own cloth rather than ship it abroad, and English cloth was beginning its long rise toward dominating the markets of Europe. So when you stood in the cloth rows of the fair and watched the grave dealing in the bales, you were watching the engine of the whole kingdom's wealth, the trade that made England rich and powerful. The fleece of its hills turned into the gold of its merchants, and the stone of its churches, and the wars of its kings. The gathering was where a great share of that wealth changed hands, and that is why the cloth rows were the gravest and richest quarter on the common. Now, there is one more trade I must do justice to, humbler than wool or wine, but, in its way, more vital still. For it was the trade that kept people alive through the winter. The salt fish and the salt and the preserved foods were the unglamorous heart of the fair's purpose, for they were how a medieval people survived the cold half of the year. And the laying in of them was a matter of life, and not merely of comfort. Understand the problem they faced. There was no way to keep fresh food through the winter, no means to halt the rot, and the cold months brought little that was fresh to eat. So that survival depended on what could be preserved from the time of plenty to last through the time of want. And the great preserver was salt. Salt fish, the herring and the cod salted and dried until they would keep for months, was the protein that fed the poor and the pious through the winter and through the many fast days of the church, when meat was forbidden. And it was bought at the autumn fairs by the barrel and the cartload against the lean season ahead. Salt itself was a major trade, the salt that preserved the meat of the autumn slaughter, packed into the barrels that would feed a household till spring. And the other keeping foods, the hard cheeses and the dried stores, were laid in here too. There was no romance in a barrel of salt herring, but there was survival in it, and the careful good wife and the provident steward bought these dull necessities with more real anxiety than they bought any silk. Because a household that came to the spring with its salt barrels empty came to the spring hungry. The gathering fed the country through its winters, and that, beneath all the wonder and the wealth, was perhaps the most important thing it did. Now, let me turn from the goods one last time and give you a few things about the festival that were not bought or sold at all. Some of the most telling things about the market were not goods at all, and the first of them was the sound of its voices, which I want you to hear once more before the quiet of the empty field. For the mart was a great Babel, a meeting of tongues such as a country person never otherwise heard, and the criers were the loudest of it. Every seller, or the boy he paid to do it, cried his wares without ceasing, and the cries were an art, short and rhythmic and repeated, shaped to carry over the din and to lodge in the ear, each trade with its own familiar call, so that a person who knew the festival could tell by the cries alone where in the rows they stood. Over and under the English cries ran the foreign speech, the Flemish and the German and the southern tongues of the merchants from over the sea, and the country dialects of every English county thrown together. The broad north and the soft west and the speech of the eastern fens, a single roaring confusion of human voice in which a dozen ways of speaking jostled at once. To stand in it was to hear, in one place, the whole spoken variety of a world that mostly lived in silence and sameness, and it was one more of the marvels the fair pressed upon the senses. Think too of what the mart meant to the great households that did so much of its serious buying. For the provisioning of a lord's establishment was a campaign in itself, and the autumn gathering was its chief battlefield. A large house held scores or hundreds of people, and feeding and clothing and supplying them through a year was an enormous and careful business. Planned and budgeted and recorded, and a large part of the year's buying was done at the fairs in a few concentrated weeks. The steward came with his lists and his authority and his master's credit, and he bought in bulk and bought shrewdly, the wine by the cask and the spice by the pound, and the cloth by the bolt, and the fish by the barrel. The wax for the lights and the iron for the smith, and the furs for the family, all the costly bulk that the Lord's house would draw on through the year. It was the medieval equivalent of a whole year's stocking up done at once. And the fair was built to serve it, for these large institutional buyers were the steadiest and richest custom the traders had. Behind many a quiet bargain in the rows lay a distant hall full of mouths to feed, and the gathering was the place where the wealth of the great was turned into the year's provision. And here is a thing about the market that I find moving, and that is its sheer age, its astonishing continuity down the centuries. The mart we have walked through, set in the last decades of the 14th century, was already old then, already more than a century and a half past King John's charter, and it would go on, year after year, for centuries more. Generation after generation, on the same stretch of common, by the same slow river, the city of booths would rise in September and be struck in autumn, and the children who gaped at the bear would grow old and bring their own children, who would bring theirs, in an unbroken chain of returnings that ran on for the better part of 500 years in all. The same field, the same season, the same raising and raising of the same temporary town, over and over, while kings rose and fell and the whole world changed around it. There is something deeply human in that, in the faithfulness of a people to a place and a season, in the way the fair became a fixed point in the turning year by which the generations could set their lives. A man could stand on that common and know that his grandfather had stood there, and his grandfather's grandfather, watching the same city rise from the same grass, and that his grandchildren would do the same. Few things in human life carry that kind of long continuity, and the great market, for all that it was built to vanish each year, was in another sense one of the most enduring features its world possessed. And because of all that, the mart lived in people the whole year round, not only in the weeks it stood. It was looked forward to through the long months of labour, the bright point ahead in the calendar of the working year, and it was looked back upon through the winter, the memories of it told and retold by the fire, the wonders described to those too young or too old or too poor to have gone, the bargains recounted and the marvels embroidered in the telling. A length of cloth, or a new knife, or a paper of pins bought at the mart was used and seen all year and carried the gathering with it, a small token of that bright few days. The news gathered there was passed on through the season. The fair, in other words, was far larger in the life of the mind than the few weeks it physically occupied, a great recurring landmark in time around which people organized their hopes and their memories. Present in imagination long after the field was bare. That is the last thing I would have you carry out of it, that the gathering was not only a place, but a season of the heart, something folk lived toward and lived upon all the year. Now, with all of that gathered up, come back with me to the empty field, for there is a last lesson in its vanishing, and then we will let the day go and turn towards sleep. There is something in the vanishing of the market that stays with me, and I think it is this. We are used to the idea that the great things of the past leave ruins behind them. Stone walls and broken towers and the marks of permanence half fallen, so that we can walk among them and feel the weight of what was. But the festival left almost nothing. It was built to vanish. Year after year, for the better part of 500 years, the richest mart in England rose out of an empty field and was struck down again. And at the end of each season, it left no monument, no ruin, no lasting mark, but a worn patch of common and a small chapel, and the holes where the posts had been. And yet for those few weeks, it had been one of the most alive places in the whole kingdom, a city of thousands, a meeting of the ends of the earth, a roar of wealth and wonder on a quiet Cambridgeshire common. There is a kind of truth in that about all of human life, I think, about how the most vivid and crowded and important things can pass and leave so little. How a whole world can gather and disperse, and the grass simply grow back over it. The fair knew what it was. It never pretended to last. It came, and it blazed, and it went, and it came again, and that was its nature, and there is a strange peace in a thing that is content to be impermanent. And the people are gone too, of course, all of them, every face in that enormous crowd. The great merchant in his furred gown, and the good wife fingering her ribbon, the steward with his list, and the cup purse with his blade, the alewife and the horse coper, and the scholar and the leper in the old chapel. Every single one of the thousands who walk those vanished lanes is 600 years dead and nameless, their bargains forgotten, their goods turned to dust, their voices long since fallen silent. The festival gathered them, and the place scattered them, and time has scattered them further into the great forgetting that takes almost everyone who has ever lived. And yet tonight, for a little while, we walked among them. We stood in their crowd and smelled their fires and heard their crying and watched them haggle over pepper and horses in the golden September light. For the space of this evening, they were not gone at all. They rose again out of the empty field. The way the fair itself rose, and we walk their lanes with them, and that is a kind of gift we can give the dead. To imagine them so truly that for an hour they live again. We have given it to them tonight, and now we can let them go. And perhaps that is the gentlest thing the market has to give us, lying here at the end of the day with all of it behind us. It gathered people, that was its whole nature, drew them in from their scattered and separate lives into one great warm crowd for a little while, and then let them go again, back to their distances, carrying something of the gathering home with them. We have done a small version of that tonight. You and I and all the others who are lying in the dark in their own far places, listening to the same quiet voice, walk the same vanished common. For a little while we were gathered too, in our way, around the same old story. And now the gathering loosens, as every mart must, and each of us drifts off toward our own sleep. There is no sadness in it. A festival was never meant to last, and neither is a waking day. And the letting go at the end of both is not a loss, but a kind of completion, the natural settling of a thing that has run its course and is ready, now, to rest. And I find, lying here at the end of it, that the market leaves me with a kind of tenderness for the people who made it and walked it and are all so long gone. They worked so hard, those vanished thousands, and travelled so far on such poor roads, and feared so much, the fire and the plague and the cut purse and the long hungry winter. And they gathered all the same, year after year, on that one bright common, to trade and to feast and to marvel and to be, for a few days, part of something far larger than their small and separate lives. They reached, through all those linked hands and waters, for the goods of a world they would never see. They snatched their few days of music and license from the hard discipline of the year. They carried home their little treasures and their gathered news and their golden memories, and they came back the next September, and the next, faithful to the fair as to an old friend, for as long as their lives allowed. And then they died, every one of them, and the market went on without them, and gathered their children, and in time died itself, and the common is quiet grass again. But they were here. They were really here on this real field, under these same stars, doing this deeply human thing of coming together to exchange the world's goods, and the world's news, and a little of the world's joy. And tonight, for a few hours, We have kept them company, so let the mart empty now, one last time, in your mind, the way it emptied at the end of every season. Let the crowds thin and the cries fall quiet. Let the golden light lengthen and fade across the common. Let the booths come down, gently, without effort, the canvas folding and the carts rolling away up the track in the dusk, until the great roaring city has dwindled to a few last lights, and then to none. And the field lies quiet and empty under the darkening sky, and there is nothing left but the slow brown river, sliding past the reeds, and the small old chapel standing in the dark, and the grass already, somehow, beginning to grow back. Let all of it settle and still. You do not have to hold any of it. You do not have to remember a single bargain or a single face. You have walked the whole of the fair today, from the cold dawn to the falling dark. And now there is little left to see, and no more to do but rest. Let your body grow heavy and still, the way the common grew still when the market was gone. Let the noise that filled the entire long day fade out of your mind, the cries and the bargaining and the beasts and the music, all of it growing distant now, softening, sinking away, until there is only quiet. Let your breathing slow and deepen, easy and unhurried, like the slow brown river that does not care whether the place is there or not, that simply slides on past the empty common under the stars, as it has done for 1,000 years. There is nothing to buy, and nothing to sell, and nothing to weigh or count or guard. The dealing is all done. The accounts are all settled. The day is over. And you may set it down, the whole bright crowded weight of it, and let yourself drift. Feel how heavy your body has become against whatever holds you, how little it wants to move, how good it is simply to lie still and let the weight of the long day press you down into rest. There is nowhere you have to be. The fair is 600 years behind you, and the morning is hours ahead. And in between there is only this, the warm dark and the quiet and the languid tide of your own breath going out and coming in. Let the last pictures of the common loosen and grow soft at the edges, the way a scene does when you are too tired to hold it, the colours bleeding gently into the dark, the sounds fading one by one until there is nothing sharp left in your mind at all, only a warm blur of having been somewhere kind, and the deep ease of leaving it behind. Let your thoughts grow slow and few. If any of it comes drifting back, a face, a colour, a scent of spice or smoke, let it come and let it go again. The way the barges came up the river and slipped away again, down it, unhurried, asking nothing of you. You do not need to follow any of it. You do not need to keep hold of a single thread. The whole bright crowded day can simply float away downstream into the dark, lighter and lighter, further and further, until it is gone over the edge of sleep, and you are left with nothing to carry and nowhere to go, and all the long quiet night ahead in which to rest. Think back over it gently if you like, the way you drift back over a long day at the very edge of sleep, not holding any of it, are just letting the pictures rise and soften and dissolve. The mist on the river in the cold dawn, and the city of Booth spread across the common. The roar of the crowd as you came through the bounds. The grave dealing in the cloth rows, and the warm strange scent of the spices. Pepper from the far side of the world, weighed out by the ounce. The cook fires and the pies eaten warm in the hand. The little tented court of the dusty feet. The horse coper trotting his beast and swearing to its soundness. The tumblers and the bear and the music in the corners. The whole vast crowd at midday, all of England in one field. The golden light of the evening, and the ale booths warm in the gathering dark. And then the striking of the city, and the empty field and the grass growing back. Let it all rise and soften and go until there is nothing left but the dark and the quiet and the unhurried, easy rhythm of your own breathing, carrying you down. And the field grows quieter still in your mind and darker and more peaceful. The last embers of the cook fires sinking to a dim red glow and then to ash, the last voices falling silent, the river sliding black and smooth beneath the stars, the old chapel a darker shape against the night, and over all of it, the great soft autumn night coming down like a blanket drawn up gently over a sleeping child. There is nothing left awake on the whole wide common now but the cam and the stars, and soon there will be nothing left awake in you either. And that is exactly as it should be. You have walked the long day to its end. You have seen the city rise and blaze and vanish. And now the only thing left in all the world is the warm dark and your own slow breathing, carrying you down, gently, by easy stages. The way the soft September night settled over the empty field, into a deep and quiet and untroubled sleep. Breathe slowly now, and let each breath carry a little more of the evening away. There is a rhythm to it, the long, easy rise and fall of it, like the quiet lap of the river against the barges in the dark, like the easy turning of the whole patient world toward its rest. You do not have to make it happen. It happens of itself. The breath going out and the breath coming in, the body knowing how to soften and sink without your help at all. The way the field knew how to grow its grass back over the scars without anyone tending it. Trust that. Let the wisdom of your own tired body take you down, the way the night took the common down into stillness and silence, gently, completely, asking nothing. The day is done, the fair is struck, the river slides on under the stars, and you are sinking, soft and slow and unafraid, toward the deep, still water of sleep. You are not at the mart anymore. You are exactly where you are, warm and safe and still, with the long day behind you and nothing ahead now but rest. The merchants and the criers are 6 centuries gone, and their city is long vanished. And yet for a few hours tonight we walked among them, and now they can rest, and so can you. There is nothing left to do. There is nowhere left to go. The gathering is struck, the field is dark, the river slides on, and you may let go of the whole of it now and sink down, easily, gently, into sleep. Let the dark be kind to you now, the way it was kind to the tired traders who lay down at last among their goods when the day's hard selling was done. They earned their rest, and so have you. Simply by living through your own day and arriving now at its quiet end. There is a deep and ancient comfort in that, in the laying down of the day's burden when the night comes, a comfort the people of that common knew, as well as we do, lying out under these same stars 600 years ago, letting the weariness carry them down into sleep. You are part of that long line of tired and resting souls, stretching back through all the centuries, all of them setting the day aside at its close and giving themselves over to the night. Join them now. Let it all go soft and far away. There is nothing left now to do, or to decide, or to carry. Every bargain of that long ago day was struck and settled and forgotten centuries before you were born. And you need settle nothing tonight but yourself. Here, into the warmth and the dark. Let the quiet deepen around you. Let the small sounds of your own room, wherever you are lying, grow distant and unimportant, the way the roar of the fair grew distant as the company walked away over the hill. There is a great soft silence coming, the silence of the empty common under the stars, the silence after everything is done. And it is reaching out to gather you in as gently as the night gathered the field. You have nowhere to go and no watch to keep. The whole of it can be set down now, and you can let yourself sink, slowly and without effort, toward the deep, still place where sleep is waiting. Before you go all the way down, one last small and quiet thing, and then I will leave you to the dark. If wandering these vanished places in the deep of the night is something that brings you any rest, then you are always welcome to come along again, whenever you like, and I will keep finding these lost worlds and laying them out as gently as I can for evenings exactly like this one. There is no hurry and nothing you need to do. The road will be here, and the next one will find you when it is ready, and the few hours we have spent together tonight on that vanished common can be the first of many such evenings, or simply a single quiet night that did its work and asked for no more. Either way, I am glad you walked it with me. The field is empty now, the fair is gone, the last cart has rolled away up the track in the dark, and the river slides on past the quiet common under the stars. And there is nothing left in all the night but your own slow breathing, carrying you down and gently down, into sleep. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.